Please. Yes, I'm now going to hand over to our second panel, Professor Makan. Please take the floor. I'm going to go outside to encourage others to come in. Please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maclean. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to panel number 2. My name is Makan Moise Zembeng. I'm a professor of international law at the University of Geneva, and I will have the privilege and honor to moderate panel number 2. Panel number 2 is dealing with the new untold stories in dispute resolution in Africa, the next chapter. When we think about new untold stories of arbitration, in particular in Africa, I think that one new untold story is what I would call the story of the semantics of arbitration. Right now in Africa, there's a lot of questions surrounding the very meaning, the very significance of arbitration. Which meaning, which significance should we attach to arbitration? And I would like to start this panel by sharing a personal story that I have encountered myself when dealing with the negotiations of the investment protocol to the AFCFTA. I have had the privilege to be the lead expert of the AFCFTA Secretariat for the negotiations and drafting of the investment protocol to the AFCFTA. As many of you surely know, since 2023, the head of states and government of the African Union have adopted that famous investment protocol to the AFCFTA. And one chapter, one part 7 of the investment protocol deals with what we call dispute management and settlement. When you read part 7 of the investment protocol, you will see that 3 avenues have been contemplated by African states to deal with investment disputes under the investment protocol. The first avenue is what is called under Article 44 of the investment protocol, state-state dispute settlement. So it's supposed to be state-state dispute settlement in accordance with the protocol on dispute settlement to the agreement establishing the free trade, the African continental free trade area. It is basically a protocol that is reflecting the rules of the WTO dispute settlement understanding. So that's the first avenue. Then you have a second avenue under the investment protocol to the AFCFTA, which is Article 45, entitled Dispute Prevention and Grievance Management. So the whole idea there is to focus on dispute prevention to avoid dispute between investors and African or states. And then there is a third avenue, and this is where the semantics of arbitration becomes interesting. There's a third avenue under the investment protocol, which is Article 46, a very mysterious provision entitled dispute resolution. Also, you have state-state dispute settlement, dispute prevention, and then suddenly you have that provision in the investment protocol entitled dispute resolution. So Article 46 basically contemplates disputes that could arise between investors and African or states. And what Article 46 says is that in case of a dispute between an investor and an African or state, first the dispute shall be settled amicably, and if amicable settlement is not possible, then the dispute shall be submitted to dispute resolution mechanisms under an annex that has to be negotiated, an annex to the investment protocol. So basically, when the protocol was adopted in 2023, the choice of African countries was to incorporate a clause of rendezvous in the investment protocol to postpone the negotiations of rules and procedures for the settlement of dispute between investors and African states. So we met We respected the appointment last year, but then the appointment didn't lead to any result, to any outcome. Why? Because when the African countries started to negotiate that annex to the investment protocol, that annex on dispute settlement, they disagreed on whether arbitration is part of what we call dispute resolution mechanisms. Huge disagreements between African countries on whether arbitration should be or not part of what we call dispute resolution mechanisms. So that's why I'm saying that one of the new untold story actually in the continent is that story of the semantics of arbitration. Which meaning, which significance do we attach to that? And so we are right now in a deadlock because of these disagreements. The annex was not finalized, the negotiations were not finalized, and of course, this is very problematic for the effectiveness, the future effectiveness of the investment protocol, because if there is no annex negotiated in relation to dispute management and settlement, many countries will not ratify the investment protocol, and this is the deadlock in which we are. The question that we need to ask ourselves is why? Why? And this is where I think that the idea, the concept of untold stories is relevant. Because there is, of course, a why. Why are we today witnessing in Africa, in particular on the side of states, some reluctance, some mistrust vis-à-vis international arbitration? And in my view, if we want to address untold stories regarding such a reluctance or mistrust vis-à-vis international arbitration, we need to ask ourselves about the factors. What are the factors behind those untold stories? And I think that there are three main factors that can explain what's going on right now in relation to arbitration in the continent. The first factor is what I would call the geopolitics of arbitration. The second one is what I would call the geographics of arbitration. And the third factor, the geophysics of arbitration. So to address each of those factors, we have the pleasure to have with us a great panel of experts that are going to share their experience, their insights, their reflections on those factors and how they can, in a way, impact or affect the perception of arbitration in the continent. I won't go into the detail of the impressive CVs of each of my panelists here. They are all rock stars in their respective fields, but I would allow myself to introduce them briefly in an alphabetical order. So we have with us Professor Andrea Bianchi, Professor of International Law at the Graduate Institute of International Studies and Development in Geneva and member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. We have with us Mr. Ziad Obeid, Managing Partner of Obeid Partners. Thank you for being with us, Ziad. We have also with us Madame Mercy Okiro, who's advocate at the High Court of Kenya and also mediator and arbitrator. Then we have Madame Nanya Owusu Onkoma Saki. Thank you, Nanya, who's partner at Bensi, Enchil, Letsa, and Onkoma. And last but not least, we have Monsieur Gadi Taj, who's Chief Legal Counsel of the African Legal Support Facility at the African Development Bank. So let me start with the first new untold story, what I call the changing geopolitics of arbitration. And here what we want to discuss with our panelists, it's basically how they perceive the impact of the changing politics on arbitration, changing politics in Africa, but maybe beyond Africa on arbitration. And I will first turn to Mercy. One of the changing political dynamics we are witnessing in the continent, and I think it was raised by us as a panelist this morning, is the issue of the rise of resource nationalism, new mining regulation. So how do you see this new political development? How do you see the effects of this new political development on arbitration? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. And I take this opportunity to thank ICCA for inviting me to speak. And I also wish to greet all the Kenyans in the room. That is the geopolitics. As I also issue a disclaimer that the views given on this panel are my own and do not in any way reflect the views of the government of Kenya. Those who know why I'm saying that, know. I move on quickly to answer Prof's question. The morning panels and the prior panels have really touched on what nationalism has done to this practice of arbitration. And I start by saying a few things about minerals. 50% of the global reserves of cobalt and manganese are found in Africa. 20% of aluminium and copper are found in Africa. And for the 15 most mineral-rich countries in sub-Saharan Africa, mining accounts for at least 8% of those countries' revenue. Of course, as was said earlier, colonialism has had its effects on Africa, and I will not delve into that. So that increasingly states then are of the opinion that they need to nationalize their resources, especially as you find that 80% of the minerals in Africa are actually expropriated and mined and sold by China. As a result, we've had coups in Africa. I'll say, quote unquote, there's what is we now call a coup belt. That's where you find coup d'etats. And of course, once the new military force comes in, the first thing they do is resource nationalism, because they are of the opinion that their minerals are not being used for the help of or the benefit of the citizens. As you heard from the World Bank, of course, citizens of Africa, investment is one of the things that will help us achieve the 30 trillion or whatever figures in the next years. So of course, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Guinea started targeting foreign companies in the last 2-3 years. And this, of course, involved nationalization of gold mines in Burkina Faso, revocation of uranium licenses in Niger, introduction of new mining codes in Mali. And of course, there was also seizure of up to about $245 million from Canadian companies that were mining there. Over the last 2 years, to note is that, again, in this resource nationalism agenda, at least 10 African countries have revised their mining codes. And it is just revising because they want to modernize, specifically to close the mining industry to the country by first changing ownership requirements so that foreign-owned companies may not really be allowed to own if there's no local director on that company. We have stricter local content rules and increased taxes. Also, there's the issue of exportation of raw materials. And this is where you find that, as I've said, 80% of what we have in minerals on this continent is actually exported as raw material and processed elsewhere. So, of course, Namibia and Zambia also come in and they restrict imports on raw materials. And Cameroon and Mali grant priority treatment to local subcontractors. We have Mali, Tanzania, DRC, which is, of course, one of our most mineral-rich countries in Africa. All of this looking to nationalize this mining industry by, again, new mining codes, increased taxes, revocation of licenses. Above, all the above, in line now with the geopolitics, again, note the 80% that China is the one handling a lot of the minerals in terms of expropriation. There is now the global big boys power struggle, and I say big boys to mean the politics and the struggle for world dominance in terms of economic power between the US and China. So of course, countries where China, which is the majority in Africa for now, countries where China is mostly present in terms of mineral mining and etc. extractives industry, the US also has entered the continent, and now they are trying to enter negotiations with Malawi and Burundi to mine more here. Because once that raw material is then turned into finished product, of course, that is increased economic power for whoever takes control of the mining industry. So whoever is in Africa in that industry also has power. Back to arbitration. Once all these laws and all these policies change with license cancellations, equity reductions, and share price crashes, of course, disputes arise. Investors are finding themselves filing more claims with all this happening. There's a lot of reliance on BITs, and then now, this is where the arbitration comes in. Most BITs, all of them will have arbitration as a dispute resolution mechanism. And just to give the data on arbitration when it relates specifically to ISDS, investor-state disputes, at least 11% of all ISDS cases as of 2019 were against African states. 28 out of African states have been sued by investors in international arbitration tribunals, with 3 countries, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, accounting for 51% of the total claims. Of course, we say other frequently targeted because indeed, this is the untold story. Some countries feel targeted by these ISDS claims, and I'll say the 3 or 4, South Africa, Tanzania, Nigeria, DRC. And that's why you see Tanzania has revised its laws, and South Africa, of course, revised its investment laws a few years back because they felt that increasingly they are the ones being on the receiving end. In total, in terms of shillings and cents, since 1993, we've had claims approximately $55.5 billion against African states, with at least 10 of them having claims exceeding $1 billion. I think I can give the case of P&ID as an example. The other side of this coin is who is the investor. The investor from at least 70% of the claimants in this case is from European nations, with US investors, of course, making up 12%, mostly relying on bilateral investment treaties, and a few, of course, on regional agreements like the South African Development Corporation. What then is the untold story in this whole background? The untold story is that African states increasingly are beginning to feel targeted in the investor-state dispute resolution where arbitration is being used. And I'll say that some states are becoming more reluctant to sign dispute resolution clauses that have international arbitration agreements because most of the times they are seated outside the continent. I have it on record at the Paris Arbitration Week where Dr. Abayomi discussed in the morning. The Attorney General of Uganda said categorically there's a stabilization clause. Now, Uganda is not going to sign that contract or enter into such agreements. Of course, the growing perception that arbitration then disproportionately favors European investors as opposed to African states. It is there. And quietly, even in my country, in Kenya, we are rethinking our BITs because arbitration is seen as no longer neutral ground. Instead, the untold story is that it looks like another form of post-colonial injustice and loss of state sovereignty and African agency. As such,
if you allow me to jump on this remark, because I think it's very important what you said now about how the rise of the resource nationalism is affecting the perception of arbitration in the continent, even if we have seen in some of the cases that change of governments has been behind the cases against those governments. But there's a second changing geopolitical dynamics in the continent, and it's in relation to sustainability policies. We know that right now we are in the era of the Africa we want, the Agenda 2063, that is inviting African states to redefine their development policies in a more sustainable development-oriented way.
Please. Yes, I'm now going to hand over to our second panel, Professor Makan. Please take the floor. I'm going to go outside to encourage others to come in. Please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maclean. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to panel number 2. My name is Makan Moise Zembeng. I'm a professor of international law at the University of Geneva, and I will have the privilege and honor to moderate panel number 2. Panel number 2 is dealing with the new untold stories in dispute resolution in Africa, the next chapter. When we think about new untold stories of arbitration, in particular in Africa. I think that one new untold story is what I would call the story of the semantics of arbitration. Right now in Africa, there's a lot of questions surrounding the very meaning, the very significance of arbitration. Which meaning, which significance should we attach to arbitration? And I would like to start this panel by sharing a personal story that I have encountered myself when dealing with the negotiations of the investment protocol to the AFCFTA. I have had the privilege to be the lead expert of the AFCFTA Secretariat for the negotiations and drafting of the investment protocol to the AFCFTA. As many of you surely know, since 2023, the head of states and government of the African Union have adopted that famous investment protocol to the AFCFTA. And one chapter, one part 7 of the investment protocol deals with what we call dispute management and settlement. When you read part 7 of the investment protocol, you will see that 3 avenues have been contemplated by African states to deal with investment disputes under the investment protocol. The first avenue is what is called under Article 44 of the investment protocol state-state dispute settlement. So it's supposed to be state-state dispute settlement in accordance with the protocol on dispute settlement to the agreement establishing the free trade, the African continental free trade area. It is basically a protocol that is reflecting the rules of the WTO dispute settlement understanding. So that's the first avenue. Then you have a second avenue under the investment protocol to the AFCFTA, which is Article 45, entitled Dispute Prevention and Grievance Management. So the whole idea there is to focus on dispute prevention to avoid dispute between investors and African or states. And then there is a third avenue, and this is where the semantics of arbitration becomes interesting. There's a third avenue under the investment protocol, which is Article 46, a very mysterious provision entitled dispute resolution. Also, you have state-state dispute settlement, dispute prevention, and then suddenly you have that provision in the investment protocol entitled dispute resolution. So Article 46 basically contemplates disputes that could arise between investors and African or states. And what Article 46 says is that in case of a dispute between an investor and an African or state, first the dispute shall be settled amicably, and if amicable settlement is not possible, then the dispute shall be submitted to dispute resolution mechanisms under an annex that has to be negotiated, an annex to the investment protocol. So basically, when the protocol was adopted in 2023, the choice of African countries was to incorporate a clause of rendezvous in the investment protocol to postpone the negotiations of rules and procedures for the settlement of dispute between investors and African states. So we met, we respected the appointment last year, but then the appointment didn't lead to any result, to any outcome. Why? Because when the African countries started to negotiate that annex to the investment protocol, that annex on dispute settlement, they disagreed on whether arbitration is part of what we call dispute resolution mechanisms. Huge disagreements between African countries on whether arbitration should be or not part of what we call dispute resolution mechanisms. So that's why I'm saying that one of the new untold story actually in the continent is that story of the semantics of arbitration. Which meaning, which significance do we attach to that. And so we are right now in a deadlock because of these disagreements. The annex was not finalized, the negotiations were not finalized, and of course, this is very problematic for the effectiveness, the future effectiveness of the investment protocol, because if there is no annex negotiated in relation to dispute management and settlement, many countries will not ratify the investment protocol, and this is the deadlock in which we are. The question that we need to ask ourselves is why? Why? And this is where I think that the idea, the concept of untold stories is relevant, because there is, of course, a why. Why are we today witnessing in Africa, in particular on the side of states, some reluctance, some mistrust vis-à-vis international arbitration? And in my view, if we want to address untold stories regarding such a reluctance or mistrust vis-à-vis international arbitration, we need to ask ourselves about the factors. What are the factors behind those untold stories? And I think that there are three main factors that can explain what's going on right now in relation to arbitration in the continent. The first factor is what I would call the geopolitics of arbitration. The second one is what I would call the geographics of arbitration. And the third factor, the geophysics of arbitration. So to address each of those factors, we have the pleasure to have with us a great panel of experts that are going to share their experience, their insights, their reflections on those factors and how they can, in a way, impact or affect the perception of arbitration in the continent. I won't go into the detail of the impressive CVs of each of my panelists here. They are all rock stars in their respective fields, but I would allow myself to introduce them briefly in an alphabetical order. So we have with us Professor Andrea Bianchi, Professor of International Law at the Graduate Institute of International Studies and Development in Geneva and member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. We have with us Mr. Ziad Obeid, Managing Partner of Obeid Partners. Thank you for being with us, Ziad. We have also with us Madame Mercy Okiro, who's advocate at the High Court of Kenya and also mediator and arbitrator. Then we have Madame Nanya Owusu Onkoma Saki. Thank you, Nanya, who's partner at Bensi, Enchil, Letsa, and Onkoma. And last but not least, we have Monsieur Gadi Taj, who's Chief Legal Counsel of the African Legal Support Facility at the African Development Bank. So let me start with the first new untold story, what I call the changing geopolitics of arbitration. And here what we want to discuss with our panelists, it's basically how they perceive the impact of the changing politics on arbitration, changing politics in Africa, but maybe beyond Africa on arbitration. And I will first turn to Mercy. One of the changing political dynamics we are witnessing in the continent, and I think it was raised by us as a panelist this morning, is the issue of the rise of resource nationalism, new mining regulation. So how do you see this new political development? How do you see the effects of this new political development on arbitration? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. And I take this opportunity to thank ICCA for inviting me to speak. And I also wish to greet all the Kenyans in the room. That is the geopolitics. As I also issue a disclaimer that the views given on this panel are my own and do not in any way reflect the views of the government of Kenya. Those who know why I'm saying that, know. I move on quickly to answer Prof's question. The morning panels and the prior panels have really touched on what nationalism has done to this practice of arbitration. And I start by saying a few things about minerals. 50% of the global reserves of cobalt and manganese are found in Africa. 20% of aluminium and copper are found in Africa. And for the 15 most mineral-rich countries in sub-Saharan Africa, mining accounts for at least 8% of those countries' revenue. Of course, as was said earlier, colonialism has had its effects on Africa, and I will not delve into that. So that increasingly states then are of the opinion that they need to nationalize their resources, especially as you find that 80% of the minerals in Africa are actually expropriated and mined and sold by China. As a result, we've had coups in Africa. I'll say, quote unquote, there's what is we now call a coup belt. That's where you find coup d'etats. And of course, once the new military force comes in, the first thing they do is resource nationalism, because they are of the opinion that their minerals are not being used for the help of or the benefit of the citizens. As you heard from the World Bank, of course, citizens of Africa, investment is one of the things that will help us achieve the 30 trillion or whatever figures in the next years. So of course, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Guinea started targeting foreign companies in the last 2-3 years. And this, of course, involved nationalization of gold mines in Burkina Faso, revocation of uranium licenses in Niger, introduction of new mining codes in Mali. And of course, there was also seizure of up to about $245 million from Canadian companies that were mining there. Over the last 2 years, to note is that, again, in this resource nationalism agenda, at least 10 African countries have revised their mining codes. And it is just revising because they want to modernize, specifically to close the mining industry to the country by first changing ownership requirements so that foreign-owned companies may not really be allowed to own if there's no local director on that company. We have stricter local content rules and increased taxes. Also, there's the issue of exportation of raw materials. And this is where you find that, as I've said, 80% of what we have in minerals on this continent is actually exported as raw material and processed elsewhere. So, of course, Namibia and Zambia also come in and they restrict imports on raw materials. And Cameroon and Mali grant priority treatment to local subcontractors. We have Mali, Tanzania, DRC, which is, of course, one of our most mineral-rich countries in Africa. All of this looking to nationalize this mining industry by, again, new mining codes, increased taxes, revocation of licenses. Above, all the above, in line now with the geopolitics, again, note the 80% that China is the one handling a lot of the minerals in terms of expropriation. There is now the global big boys power struggle, and I say big boys to mean the politics and the struggle for world dominance in terms of economic power between the US and China. So of course, countries where China, which is the majority in Africa for now, countries where China is mostly present in terms of mineral mining and etc. extractives industry, the US also has entered the continent, and now they're trying to enter negotiations with Malawi and Burundi to mine more here. Because once that raw material is then turned into finished product, of course, that is increased economic power for whoever takes control of the mining industry. So whoever is in Africa in that industry also has power. Back to arbitration. Once all these laws and all these policies change with license cancellations, equity reductions, and share price crashes, of course, disputes arise. Investors are finding themselves filing more claims with all this happening. There's a lot of reliance on BITs, and then now, this is where the arbitration comes in. Most BITs, all of them will have arbitration as a dispute resolution mechanism. And just to give the data on arbitration when it relates specifically to ISDS, investor-state disputes, at least 11% of all ISDS cases as of 2019 were against African states. 28 out of African states have been sued by investors in international arbitration tribunals, with 3 countries, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, accounting for 51% of the total claims. Of course, we say other frequently targeted because indeed, this is the untold story. Some countries feel targeted by these ISDS claims, and I'll say the three or four: South Africa, Tanzania, Nigeria, DRC. And that's why you see Tanzania has revised its laws, and South Africa, of course, revised its investment laws a few years back because they felt that increasingly they are the ones being on the receiving end. In total, in terms of shillings and cents, since 1993, we've had claims approximately $55.5 billion against African states, with at least 10 of them having claims exceeding $1 billion. I think I can give the case of P&ID as an example. The other side of this coin is who is the investor. The investor from at least 70% of the claimants in this case is from European nations, with US investors, of course, making up 12%, mostly relying on bilateral investment treaties, and a few, of course, on regional agreements like the South African Development Corporation. What then is the untold story in this whole background? The untold story is that African states increasingly are beginning to feel targeted in the investor-state dispute resolution where arbitration is being used. And I'll say that some states are becoming more reluctant to sign dispute resolution clauses that have international arbitration agreements because most of the times they are seated outside the continent. I have it on record at the Paris Arbitration Week where Dr. Abayomi discussed in the morning. The Attorney General of Uganda said categorically there's a stabilization clause. Now, Uganda is not going to sign that contract or enter into such agreements. Of course, the growing perception that arbitration then disproportionately favors European investors as opposed to African states. It is there. And quietly, even in my country, in Kenya, we are rethinking our BITs because arbitration is seen as no longer neutral ground. Instead, the untold story is that it looks like another form of post-colonial injustice and loss of state sovereignty and African agency. As such,
if you allow me to jump on this remark, because I think it's very important what you said now about how the rise of the resource nationalism is affecting the perception of arbitration in the continent, even if we have seen in some of the cases that change of governments has been behind the cases against those governments. But there's a second changing geopolitical dynamic in the continent, and it's in relation to sustainability policies. We know that right now we are in the era of the Africa we want, the Agenda 2063, that is inviting African states to redefine their development policies in a more sustainable development-oriented way. And when engaging in new sustainability policies, in particular in relation to energy or climate change, governments also feel confronted with challenges and obstacles. So Gadi, can you tell us a bit more about that? How do you see, the potential impacts or risks for arbitration when it comes to that new political dynamic? Thank you.
Thank you, Makan. Yes, I thought I would be the controversial today, but Mercy really set the scene, so I think everything I'm going to say is going to be lighter. But it is, and just to give you my perspective, so I work for the African Legal Support Facility, which is a facility within the AFDB that only represents African governments. So it's really from an African state point of view that I speak today, but I'm not an arbitrator or a practitioner, so please apologies if I make any mistake with the name of the concept or the labels. But yes, we are seeing, I work in various types of transaction, a few arbitration cases as well with African states, but we deal a lot with the energy transition policies and transactions that are related to it. And we're seeing a growing stigma. So it goes beyond just resource nationalism, but there is definitely a growing stigma about arbitration because of some of the stats that were highlighted by Mercy. But just to try to validate a little bit my first-hand experience while preparing for that panel, I looked up a few reports, and there is one from the UN in 2023 that looked at thousands of arbitration claims against states, and 78.6% of them were against developing or middle-income countries, and over 2/3 of them would be ultimately awarded against the states. So there's clearly a huge number of cases against African states, and they often will be ultimately a negative consequence. If we look more precisely to the energy transition, I think there are several factors for it, one of which was described this morning by our World Bank colleague, Andrew, which is the fact that the balance sheet of governments is more and more constrained. So we have to look at investors, private investors, in traditionally more public-dominated sector, such as electricity, for example. With these kind of transaction being signed, you always will have some arbitration clauses for foreign investors. At least that's the market standard. So definitely these new transactions are bringing some claims, but also the nature or the feature of these transactions are slightly different to what we were seeing before, where conventional technology would have bigger power plant with fossil fuels or big hydro dam. With the transition, you have smaller transaction related to solar and wind. So to arrive to the same amount of energy created, you often will have several projects instead of one big one. And as we said, they will be invested by the private sector. So you will have more potential because of the number of contracts, and the government used to be the funder of these projects, and now the private sector is, so definitely arbitration can arise from there. On top of it, there is also a lot of policies that need to be implemented for the energy transition. And what we're seeing, in addition to the potential risk of arbitration from the renewable energy transaction, is also the more conventional developers that will challenge the policies and force the government to withdraw some of these policies. And not to take stand on climate change, but you can imagine for a state that is first being told, we are not investing in your country if you don't accept arbitration clauses. That's number one. But on top of it, often we'll have some clear objectives from DFIs, from international organizations, from their international commitments in transitioning, and then arbitration is used to force them back into a previous policy position. So that creates quite a bit of frustration and ultimately leads to what they qualify or what they call an encroachment into their African sovereignty. I could go on quite a bit, but
you don't need to go on, because I want just to jump on this to get to my next question here.
Please.
Because it's very interesting what you say is that African countries, and maybe sometimes even the general public opinion, tend to see arbitration as, a tool for regulatory chill, for preventing states from engaging into more proactive climate policy or energy transition policies. But when we look at the picture of what's going on, we are seeing that, yes, you have these cases that investors bring against states because of, policies that are limiting the use of fossil fuels. But you have the other cases where investors are, in a way, victims of new renewable energy policies from government that are stepping back from positive policies in terms of renewable energy. So we heard about the state's perception. But what about the companies' perception? How do they feel about this changing geopolitics landscape? And how do they see arbitration as being part of the conversation when we look at the changing political landscape? Nanya?
Okay, first of all, I want to take a step back. We have energy transition policies right now on the continent. And for companies, they are in a difficult position because, number one, ever-changing legal landscape. Laws are changing, governments are reacting, and it's difficult for companies to keep up. The second thing, ever-changing regulatory policies. They need to adapt to the changes that the governments are making to their policies, and a lot of times it's in the middle of an investment, and therefore it's not something that they've planned for, it's not something that they are equipped for, and it's something that really affects their finances. I think another thing too is if you think about resource nationalism amid the desire to procure all these battery metals that they call it. We have cobalt, we have lithium, we have graphite. There's certainly a move towards mining these resources. And companies have invested a lot in African countries to try and mine these resources. However, because of resource nationalism, these investments are under threat. And so for companies, it's a very challenging environment. And in my work, I often represent investors. It's very difficult for them. I think all of this environment creates a very fertile ground for disputes, a heightened risk of disputes. But it's not all gloom and doom, because I think for arbitration practitioners, this is where we need to be happy. There's going to be a lot more work for us. And just, thinking about it more generally, if you think about potential sources of disputes from climate change, you can look at disputes between foreign investors and host states. There are disputes between states and other transnational actors. There are contractual disputes arising out of industry transitions. We have contractual disputes resulting out of climate change-related policy or conduct. We have cases brought to seek financial redress for damages associated with the effects of climate change. But it's good because it also presents an opportunity. Think about it. There's a very new, emerging, untold story on the continent: carbon markets. And I think that's an area that we all have to really start looking at. I'll just say that in 2022, they launched the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative. And the goal for this is by 2030 to achieve an industry that's generating $6 billion in just 5 years. This is the kind of fiscal regime we are going to have. And I think this is just beyond theory, because you can see that states are reacting. If you look at Kenya, Ghana, Rwanda, South Africa, they've all put in place legislation to partake in the carbon markets industry. And there's also another opportunity there for us: disputes, disputes, disputes.
I like that. I like that very much. Disputes, disputes, disputes. Gadi and Mercy have come up with a more skeptical assessment of what could be the impact of the changing geopolitics on arbitration. But you see a new generation, a baby boom, yes, of arbitration cases. So very good. But then now, my question is whether all this is an African exception. Because we tend, whenever we have these conversations about arbitration in the continent, we tend to think that, this is an African exception. But is it really an African exception, this all changing geopolitics and the potential impacts on arbitration? And, how can we make actually arbitration resilient to changing geopolitics? And which lessons could we learn from elsewhere, in particular the MENA region, Ziad?
Thank you, Makan. Let me first say that it's truly a privilege to join this important conversation. One, as you so aptly described just earlier, is not just about the past of dispute resolution in Africa, but about its future. And the future that Africa is, in my view, now in a position to shape. So to turn to your question, is there an African exception? From my perspective, not really. At least not in the way it's often implied. Africa is not uniquely vulnerable, nor is it alone in facing these challenges. What we are witnessing are patterns familiar across certain regions when states experience sort of political or economic transition, or often when they are facing a wave of investor-state arbitration. They may face common challenges when it comes to arbitration and their positioning within the system, whether it's in Africa, Latin America, or indeed the Middle East. And obviously finding the right balance between protecting state interests and maintaining investor confidence, but also attractivity, is not always an easy endeavor. So for me, what may be distinctive is not an exception, but an African crossroads. That's what I would call it. A sort of decisive moment, really, where diverging visions and experiences, economic ambition and regional transformation all intersect. And yes, that complexity requires specific responses, but it does not place Africa outside the system. Quite the opposite. I think it positions Africa in a place where it can shape the system from within. Now, interestingly, when you look at other regional initiatives, for example, and I want to come back on your opening points about the annex and the discussions to the AFCTFA, in the context of the MENA region, some of you will remember, or potentially we can draw a parallel that emerges with the organization of the Islamic Cooperation Investment Agreement in 1981. So this agreement at the time aimed to create a sort of a permanent dispute resolution organ for investor-state matters amongst member states. It was a bold idea at the time that, however, did not quite take off. And you've asked the question why, and so the why was simple at the time. First, political disagreement over appointments, lack of funding, and no real political will. And of course, in some instances, political interference, not to make appointments. So in the end, it was an organ for the resolution of disputes that was by design, but not by commitment. And that organ was never established. And so ad hoc arbitration filled the gap, but sometimes not always successfully, because the framework really was incomplete. And some of you will have heard of the case which was set aside by the Paris Court of Appeal, which was annulled, actually, a partial award, finding that the tribunal had been improperly constituted under the IOC framework. So as I see it, the takeaway for Africa is clear. Institutions that are born on paper, without consensus, without funding, or political ownership become symbolic and not functional. So if I want to, you've asked me about potentially what sort of, what other experiences we can draw from the Middle East and what sort of proposals. My modest proposal, very briefly, would be really not to wreck the system, reform it. The architecture of the ISDS was never perfect, but it served a purpose. And that was a neutral space for resolving disputes between states and investors. And that logic still holds today, but we need a smarter ISDS, I think, one that is more transparent, better balanced, and aligned with development goals. And for example, coming from my region and an angle with Africa, we see examples of this new approach in the Morocco-Nigeria BIT and the new UAE-India BIT. Both preserve ISDS and arbitration, but include investors' obligation, sustainability provisions, and greater space for host state regulation. So if the problem was with the substantive protections or the way those were, the leeway that was sort of perceived as being granted or discretion to arbitrators, states can reform that from within by actually agreeing to new treaties. And the problem is not necessarily in arbitration itself. So finally, the last point for me on this issue, I think that we should not forget the geopolitical shift which is underway, and that's very important. For example, if you just take last year alone, the investment driven from the Gulf into Africa exceeded $110 billion. in infrastructures, telecom, and energy. And also, you have Gulf sovereign wealth funds that are reshaping the landscape. They are becoming investors in Africa. And so African states are no longer just respondents, if they see it that way, but they are host to global South capital. And that comes with new expectations, including the expectation that ISDS system will remain and function fairly. And so again, I think to conclude very briefly, I think it's good to evolve. Let us evolve. We can make it better, arbitration, but not obsolete. And I think its neutrality and its flexibility, but also its ad hoc nature, are still powerful. So the challenge is to reform smartly, not abandon prematurely.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ziad. This is fantastic. But in one point that is among all the interesting points, but one point that is very interesting in your remarks is what I would call the complexity of the geopolitics. That we cannot see Africa as being clinically isolated. There's a lot of external pressure. You know, Africa with Europe, Africa with North America, Africa with Asia, Africa with the Gulf, Africa with, you know, Latin American countries. And maybe the whole uncertainty regarding arbitration has to be looked, you know, in the lens of that complex geopolitics. You were mentioning Organization of Islamic Cooperation. You know, to share another untold story, I was once, I was in the AFCFTA negotiations on the investment protocol, where one country, I'm not going to name the country out of courtesy, was defending investor-state arbitration under the investment protocol. The next morning, we were online in a meeting of the League of Arab States. The same country with the same negotiator was against arbitration. Next day. And he knows that I know, what he said the day before. And so I think this is showing how the complexity of geopolitics can have an impact also on the perception of arbitration. But allow me now to come to my second set of questions in relation to what I would call the changing geographics. The geographical environment here in Africa, we know that we are now in the era of the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the idea is to build a new era of trade and investment integration. So how do you perceive the potential opportunities or risks of this new era of economic integration on arbitration? How can we make sure that implementation of AFCFTA could lead to a new generation wave of disputes, but also of arbitration processes? And my first question is, why do we need a sustainable ecosystem for arbitration, for a successful and effective implementation of the AFCFTA? Nanya?
Where there are large volumes of trade, disputes inevitably follow. And especially where the trade is cross-border in nature, there are three things that participants in that ecosystem are concerned about. Number one, neutrality. Where there are disputes, they want a neutral forum to resolve the dispute. Two, the possibility of ease of enforcement across borders. And I think that arbitration allows us to be able to deal with these matters. But coming, to your question about building a sustainable ecosystem, without a sustainable arbitration ecosystem, trade cannot go on because the people involved will rely on that system. And what does it really mean? What does it really mean to have a sustainable arbitration ecosystem? And I think I'll take it from various levels. From the institutional level, we need to ensure that our African arbitration centers are strengthened, they have the capacity to deal with the disputes that will arise out of trade. I think that we've been talking about disputes being settled out of Africa, but where there's inter-African trade, the best way to resolve those disputes will be using our African institutions, and therefore it presents a great opportunity for our arbitral institutions. One other thing that really concerns me, and I think we need to address at the cognitive level, we need to find a way to destigmatize arbitration for African states. And I think that's the major problem we are encountering at the moment. More and more African states are viewing arbitration as a threat that must be avoided, rather than as a dispute resolution mechanism that must be embraced. And I think there are systemic issues, and the way to deal with that will, first of all, I think, capacity building. Because if you look at most of the causes for this kind of resistance towards arbitration, it's because within the system, they haven't built the capacity to be able to deal with issues in a way that does not result in unfavorable arbitration awards against them. And if you just allow me, I think that, we have a case right now where the Kingdom of Lesotho went through an arbitration, right? And the main issue there really was that they didn't participate in the arbitration proceedings because they felt that there wasn't any basis for them to do so. And you can see that that underlying problem was a misunderstanding about the principle of separability. I think when we build capacity, some of these things can be plugged. Also, there must be a systemic reshaping of the way governments undergo their contracting and contracting practices to be able to ensure that there's a clear understanding of the process through which government should contract. And lastly, I think we need to also ensure that where there's an auditing procedure that governments go through, where they want to change policies, where they want to implement policies, where they want to address certain things for public interest, they are able to take a risk-benefit analysis. They're able to have consultations with investors who may be affected, and there must be collaboration within the government itself so that the risk of arbitration awards is lessened.
That's excellent. So the message is very clear. There cannot be any trade integration in the continent without arbitration. And Africa cannot be a credible destination for investment without arbitration, and you touched upon some of the parameters that can allow to build a sustainable arbitration ecosystem. Mercy, how do you see some of the parameters addressed by Nanya, and what are the parameters you see?
Thank you. I agree with Nanya on capacity building. And just before I answer your question, it is also noteworthy that in Africa, before the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is basically pretended to be the largest trading bloc globally, we have our own regional groupings or regional agreements and cooperation. Like, for instance, we are in East Africa now, East Africa Community. For those who don't know, I use an East Africa Community passport because we have EAC. We also have the South Africa Development Corporation, COMESA. Now, beyond the regional groupings and now moving into this new era of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, quickly, there's a patchwork of legal framework, and not all countries are the same in terms of the modernization and the arbitration laws. Harmonization of the legal framework will make for good protocol, and harmonization does not mean that we'll have one arbitration act or law that all of us use under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But there are certain core things that you must look at in this harmonization. For instance, we have to agree that we need to have laws that are compatible with core procedural standards that are accepted now as lex arbitri worldwide. The issue of enforcement and recognition of awards, even for those states perhaps that are not really signatory to the New York Convention, but now with 49 countries out of 55 being signatories to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, that will also need to be in the protocol, clarity on enforcement and recognition. Of course, also sustainability in the form of coherence of how the laws are. They flow in a similar way so that there's a bit of course, I'll say predictability, if I may. And with Africa, of course, having a lot of MSMEs being medium and small micro enterprises, that being the core of our economy, is not so much the multinationals. International arbitration, as always, you'll find it's a multinational being involved in the dispute. But now, under the ACTA, we'll also have to see how to include these MSMEs, the small and medium enterprises, to have access to arbitration as a dispute resolution. That may mean perhaps even subsidize legal costs, etc. Data and transparency will go hand in hand. We've had digitization and technology. Of course, we'll need effective data collection so that we have monitoring and evaluation. Of course, publications of decisions that have public interest, because this also will create more legitimacy in the system and acceptance. Lastly, to add is political buy-in, and states need to be involved at all steps, because if it looks like something foreign that is being brought again, yet it is under AFTA, the same pushback that we've had under ISDS as is currently is what we'll have. So that and also states committing under the protocol to streamline the issue of the role of courts, court support for arbitration, and also limited political interference in arbitration process and respecting arbitration awards. That's where I'd say.
Thank you so much, Mercy. You emphasize the importance of harmonization. That's very interesting, because that is another untold story. In the continent, you know, when we were doing the negotiations of the investment protocol to the FCFTA, there has been a lot of battles between states on whether the word harmonization should be put in the protocol. And at the end, they opted for alignment. Alignment is something softer than harmonization. I don't know how alignment, you know, how far it should go. But the reality in the continent is that many countries are not necessarily convinced that the way forward should be, you know, in building a sustainable arbitration ecosystem should be based on arbitration. But you raise also another issue, which is how do we address the needs and the concerns of the states when sinking new arbitration ecosystem, in particular in the context of the FCFTA. And Gadi, I would like to have your opinion on that. Do you think that the concerns of states, and in particular their sustainability concerns, are sufficiently taken into account in the conversation on that new arbitration ecosystem?
I'm not sure if they're sufficiently taken into account, but I think they must be taken into account for it to be a success. And Ziad's intervention was really on point, mentioning sustainability and development goals being part of the framework to allow governments to know that there is some level of their needs and concerns that it is taking into consideration while putting the framework. But I'll go even a little bit further than that. And Zania mentioned the Lesotho case, and I think it's a very, very good case to show how often we tend to assume that the stronger party in an investor-state dispute resolution will be the state. And I think the framework, if it wants to be owned by African states, should reflect the fact that often the stronger party is the investor, and that you need to have some mechanism and some support for the state to be able to not be completely steamrolled in the proceeding. So from experience, just the fact that it would be a framework and an institution on the continent is already huge for perception. The number of times that we had AG representative telling us, look, can we change the arbitration seat so that it's in South Africa instead of Paris or New York? And just that for them was giving more comfort, while we know that in practice it won't change much, and that, yeah, ultimately arbitration has very similar rules in these jurisdictions. But definitely there is a huge opportunity through the free trade agreement to reset the perception of arbitration, to bring ownership, and to also have a type of arbitration that brings benefits more than just the negative consequences, right? So if you see one of your own companies winning a case against a neighboring country because they were treated unfairly, it makes you pause when you're not agreeing to arbitration, because you saw the benefits for your own companies, which I think that free trade agreement can bring some quick benefits and quick illustration of the positive aspects of arbitration. So definitely I'd love to see a real framework be put in place and some case law, and not case law, but arbitrations happening, and hopefully not a framework only for the free trade agreement scope, but something broader, because once you've put it in place, it could be also for foreign investment from Western countries or even Middle East and Asia.
Thank you so much, Gadi, and I think your message about ownership is very powerful. But how do we build that? How do we make sure that African countries own the building, of that new or renewed arbitration ecosystem? Ziad, from your experience, how can ownership be built?
Thank you, Makan. Maybe I should say first that, in my view, for me, ownership is not a slogan. It is a strategy. And here, if I want to look at the Middle East, I think it offers both cautionary tales and useful examples. For a long time, arbitration in the region was seen as foreign, in some places even threatening, and in most places in the Middle East as an exceptional mode of dispute resolution. That resistance led to patchy laws, weak enforcement, and general mistrust. And of course, it colored also the approach of the judges enforcing awards, and we saw a lot of decisions that would not sit well with what we would call today an arbitration-friendly jurisdiction. But fortunately, that has changed. And I want to give one example, Saudi Arabia, to tell you why it's important. Because what we're seeing in Saudi Arabia is a real transformation, not just reform. And of course, they have a new arbitration law. They've established the ICCA. But most importantly, for me, is that there is a strategic state support for arbitration as part of a national economic policy to support a vision for 2030, for example. And to share a small anecdote, I had the pleasure of meeting a few years ago the then Minister of Justice of Saudi Arabia. And we were a little bit discussing the importance of arbitration and how is Saudi Arabia going to cope with potentially the caseload that the courts will have to handle if the projects that we see in the Vision 2030 are going to be put in place. And that was a few years ago. So the minister, who is a former judge and very cognizant of both the opportunities but the difficulties and the challenge in the system, was very clear in terms of saying that I have two options. Because in Saudi Arabia, you have the Board of Grievances that deal with disputes. Disputes are the proceedings are in Arabic. Judges have not necessarily, have traditionally worked in an environment that was relatively closed. And now suddenly things are opening up and changing and developing and gearing up for major projects. So he said that, well, I have two options. Either I have to upscale capacity and build capacity within the courts, or I have to outsource and then remove those sort of disputes from the local court system. And being cognizant of immediately the challenges of suddenly, telling, your judges that, well, you've been dealing with these types of disputes, tomorrow you're going to have a multi-billion-dollar metro project and infrastructure project and a vision supporting 2030, and with complex international parties, you're going to have to deal with those disputes. That's not going to work immediately. So he saw with arbitration an opportunity. And that formed part of the vision which now we see today, that sort of national arbitration was part of a national economic policy. And that's, I think, a very important lesson. And so the shift was really profound. And over the years, when you look at the MENA in general, we basically moved from resistance to ownership, and by design, by strategy. And so Africa, for me, can take this further, because of course it's not enough to have a law, it's not enough to have a center. A true arbitration ecosystem requires, in my view, institutions that are independent and credible, consistent and transparent rules, of course, skilled arbitrators, very important, and integration with the national courts, where you have sort of seamless coordination, and user confidence, both from state and the investors. And maybe just one last observation on this. I think as MENA investment grows into Africa, there is a chance to build really trusted African venues for intra-African and South-South disputes, and that's an important opportunity going forward. So Africa should not only host arbitration, it should drive it, in my view, on its own term and with its own voice.
That's fantastic. Okay, in its own terms, driving arbitration in its own terms. So this brings me then to the next untold story, which is, how do we shift the geophysics of arbitrations? How do we boost structural changes in the continent, in Africa, for arbitration to be perceived as an opportunity and not as a risk, as many countries these days are perceiving it? How do we get there? And so, Gadi and Mercy, we've been hearing, for instance, Nanya mentioning capacity building. How can we strengthen state capacity in relation to arbitration beyond the capacity building label?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I mean, I've been working on capacity building. In every project we always have a bit of capacity building, and obviously when there is an arbitration clause in a contract, we try to inform as much as possible the government. But the government is a very fluid entity, a lot of changes within the government, and arbitration notification are not necessarily given to the people who were part of the training. Although I think it's still very important to continue training government, I think there is a need for a permanent structure in each country, be it if there is an arbitration center or if there is none, even the bar, to be a resource for African governments with respect to the proceedings and consequences. If you knew the number of times that I heard that a government does not have to answer to arbitration because it's an encroachment on their sovereignty, you would be very, very surprised. It is still the thinking of many lawyers within governments, and that's an issue, because if you don't even present, even if you're right that the contract is not valid, as it was the case for Lesotho case, for example, you have to show up, right? That's the first rule, and you have to be represented. But a lot of governments don't even do that step, and if they would have resources within the country to be able to at least have some guidance on the first steps while they're getting a budget line, for example, to be able to hire lawyers, arbitrators, or practitioners like yourself, it would go a long way. So everything that we're doing now is good, but I think ownership within each country will be crucial. So a permanent structure that is there, that governments know they can rely on if they have questions on arbitration, is going to be key.
Mercy?
Thank you. Just to add, I agree with what my co-panelist has said, and I'll use examples of Kenya to answer your question, Prof, on how then do we build state capacity. I think 10 years or so ago, our Attorney General, who was cognizant, Professor Githu Muigai, was very aware of ISDS and generally the practice of arbitration. So this gap, and I'll answer using examples from what happened in Kenya. First, I must state that in Kenya, whenever we have ISDS cases, we don't turn to external counsel. We only have one English barrister who leads us mostly. Our state law office, who are paid government officers, are the ones who do the matters, and even when we take counsel to support private counsel, we take local counsel. How did this happen? One, there was a team set up in the State Law Office of Kenya where there was a deliberate effort in capacity building, first by sending staff, that is lawyers who work in that department too, and I know Professor Makane, you've taught some of them at MIDS, to go and learn more about ISDS at that master's level, number one. Number two, training in the basics of arbitration, that is, of course, in Kenya, Chartered Institute of Arbitrators is the trainer. So, quote unquote, not really mandatory, but mandatory training, so that everyone in that department understands arbitration. In terms of negotiations, and most Africans here can say, if you meet ancestral working groups whenever you go or any negotiations, people are out there shopping and not really attending the negotiations. And the representative comes back and they sign whatever. Now, in Kenya, whoever goes that, there's a shopper, but then there's also the technical person nowadays. And the technical person is not just a lawyer. They are accompanied by a subject matter expert. If you're going to negotiate, for instance, I was involved in the negotiation for trade services, actually traded services for after the paper we were going to present in Ghana. And at that point, they picked experts from the construction industry to go. So there were people who came with us to see how that place looks, but we had subject matter experts because a good number of disputes starts first with how the contract was negotiated and drafted. So that expertise, states must be strategic and deliberate. The last two things, having a standing team, if I may say so, just as in the example of Kenya, where anytime there's a dispute or a potential dispute against the state, that is Kenya, the team is able to assess whether to move on with the arbitration, like we're going to fight this out, or get into mediations or negotiations before the dispute crystallizes, and that has happened so that a good number of our disputes don't even make it to proper hearing, arbitration. They are settled because there's that strategic and expert team that assesses. Lastly, state actors, and by state actors, and back to everything, really what we're saying is ownership. We have to be involved from the beginning, from the negotiation of contracts, and really to feel that we are involved so that when a disputes come, we say, okay, this is disputes arising from something we agreed to. And since this is an African conference and we're here to see the untold stories, all those, for instance, now the Kenya example, we really need to first of all also look at peer learning. So that states that have had more ISDS cases have said the Algerians, the DRCs now filing even counterclaims. We can exchange these ideas as states so that we see which states have more experience, what do they do different, what can we learn from them. And really, if we can even put this under either the AU or the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, that would help us because also, as he said, we would have given Lesotho our counsel, maybe if they'd spoken to us well, but now they did not, but that's just in jest. But in a nutshell, I'd say those would be my additional points.
Thank you very much, Mercy. And Gadi, you insisted on the institutional changes that are needed for the changing geophysics of arbitration. But is it only a matter of institutions? What about the culture? What about the reflex? How do we shape an African arbitration reflex or culture on the continent? Ziad and Nanya.
Thank you. I think this is where theory meets reality. Because no matter how good your laws are, if the state is not ready to detect and respond to disputes, things unravel fast. And so in the MENA, we saw this often. Ministries took conflicting positions. Legal strategy was outsourced at the last minute. Disputes escalated when they could have been resolved early. But we also saw adaptation, and that was very refreshing. I want to give the example of Egypt. We have with us the pleasure of having Professor Dr. Abdul Wahab, who's much better positioned than me to talk about that. But Egypt builds a centralized dispute unit after it faced a wave of arbitration in the wake of the Arab Spring. And so it built this centralized dispute unit, coordinated across ministries, developed internal protocols for managing ISDS claims, and really did a great job in enhancing state capacity. And basically that kind of structure, which is proactive, strategic, and informed, is what I call the arbitration reflex. Now, if in your question you also asked about how African countries can develop that arbitration reflex, I think early detection and response mechanism is very important first. They can develop that. and that is to spot the risks before they become disputes, very important. The second point is state coordination. We've seen it too often where you can have contradictory messaging or internal turf wars, so this should be avoided. And the third is the example that I gave, Egypt, is build in-house legal capacity. Build knowledge internally, not just through external counsel, but bring qualified lawyers within your in-house legal team. And crucially, I think expand the toolbox. When we're talking about expanding the toolbox, arbitration, of course, is essential, but it's not exclusive. Mediation is still underused. And with the right safeguards, it can deliver sometimes faster, more sustainable outcomes, and especially for lower stakes claims. So that's something that one needs to consider. And of course, technology and AI can transform how disputes are monitored, tracked and prepared, and especially for under-resourced governments. So that's something also that they can put at their disposal. And I think personally it's no longer a luxury. It is a necessity to embrace that. And I finally, just very quickly, if I may, I found Gadi's comments and the entire panel's comment very interesting about some of the reactions. For example, states not even responding or finding it necessary to respond to a request for arbitration. I can tell you that from experience. Like, for example, take Lebanon. A country like Lebanon also not only failed to participate in the constitution of the tribunal and appoint an arbitrator. When you look at the number of qualified international arbitrators, Lebanese of Lebanese origin, is simply unacceptable. And so there are also other situations, and I will not name them, where there's a problem in some regions where you have very businessmen who are also part of government. So for example, you take a telecom project, you have clearly an individual who's behind one of the biggest telecom operators, but this individual is a leading figure in the government. Suddenly there's a dispute, and you as external counsel find yourself in this very odd situation where you're trying to defend a state that wants to lose, which is, no resources, no experts, no information. And so that's, again, some of the issues that can be avoided if we think a little bit about the reflexes that can be developed and the toolbox.
Thank you, Ziad. So, Nanya, you were calling for disputes. How do we shape this arbitration reflex in African countries, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll share the sentiments that have just been shared. One of the ways in which to build an arbitration culture is to remove the impediments that generates those negative feelings towards arbitration. Something we haven't talked about, costs. I mean, for African parties, the sheer cost of arbitration is a huge deterrent. And I think that we really need to focus on building a third-party funding ecosystem to assist African parties in arbitrations. A lot of times, people are not able to perform at arbitration, and we talked about the fact that you don't have a team, you don't have experts. A lot of these come with costs. And if you have a third-party funders who are putting in the money, I think some of these can be plugged. Another area I think that has already been mentioned is AI and technology. I think, really for us to be able to be competitive, we need to be able to incorporate AI. Parties, institutions, even arbitrators, we are getting to the point where, looking at the next chapter, we need to fully embrace AI. And I think, especially for arbitral institutions, case management, using AI-assisted applications for case management truly helps. I've looked at how the ICCA Connect works, and it's an excellent system. I also think that if we are going to be thinking about AI, there are some questions, fundamental questions we need to ask ourselves. Number one, I think, do parties have to disclose that they are using AI tools? That's one question that we need to answer. The second question is it simply disclosing that you're using an AI tool, or must you also disclose the algorithm behind the AI tool, because some of these algorithms, there are inherent biases in them, and do we need to disclose these? And for arbitrators, to what extent can they use AI tools? We'll be kidding ourselves if we think that arbitrators are not using AI tools, for example, to summarize some of the documents, analyzing evidence, identifying patterns. But we need to get to a point where we are deciding, can they use AI for evaluative aspects of determining the case? And then what is the acceptable use of AI tools? What are the limitations? What are the risks? We need to think about all of these things. And I think an AI protocol perhaps is something that we need to think about having.
Thank you so much, Nanya. And this brings us to the very, very last part of our conversation in panel 2, writing the next chapter. Because this is not just about the new untold stories, but it's about the next chapter. How do we go from those new untold stories to the next chapter? And I'm now going to turn to Andrea. The stories behind the untold stories of arbitration in Africa. From the discussion we've been having here, which lessons do you think we can draw from that discussion, and why is it important to build an African narrative or African narratives of arbitration for more effective use of arbitration in the continent? Andrea.
Thank you so much, Mekan. No one could have done a better job at luring me into this conversation than the ones who decided to put the title Untold Stories. I have no less than a fascination for the untold and the unsaid, as I believe that to bring these to the fore help us understand better the realities we live and the challenges we have to meet as legal professionals. But why is it that stories are untold? Let's try to debunk the untold. Sometimes these stories are not known, as some of the stories we have just heard from Mekan and our co-panelists. Sometimes people are scared at telling them for whatever reason, or they think that they will not be of interest to anybody, that they are irrelevant. Some other times, stories may be kept hidden because there are some vested interests that prevent them from being told. Believe me, none of these is a good reason to leave a story untold. And then there is the other prong of the expression untold stories. Several years ago, I wrote a piece on international adjudication and storytelling, and I made the point that law is naturally embedded in society and culture, and as such, it has an inherently narrative component, as it must address the concrete needs of the community it claims to regulate. Law is not Newtonian mechanics. It does not operate in a vacuum by way of automatic, intellectually neutral operations, whereby the correct legal interpretation of the law gets applied to an objective set of facts. In fact, as lawyers, we all tell stories. Whoever engages with the law is called upon to tell a story. It could be a counsel before a tribunal, arguing on behalf of a client, or a judge who needs to present a reasoning in a way that persuades the audience to which it is addressed. Almost invariably, a judgment or an award tells a story with some sort of plot, with characters, the people involved, the applicable law. Academics, somewhat notoriously, tell stories all the time, don't they? Indeed, we are professional storytellers. We build stories that we hope will gain adherence to our arguments, give us authority to speak, and convince a decision maker to do or not to do something. Storytelling lies at the very core of our activities as lawyers. And there is always a perspective from which a story is told, which is never neutral. A standpoint from which one looks at things determines what we see. Storytelling is about choosing a perspective, narrating from a given standpoint. There is no such thing as a view from nowhere in narration. It's about giving the story a certain spin, foregrounding elements and characters, devising a plot, and sequencing arguments. And storytelling is no solitary exercise. You need an audience to tell the story, and the community in which the story can take up meaning. Stories are what make societies and communities cohesive, as they enhance the sense of belonging and ownership. They give value to life, both professionally and in our own lives as well. That's how stories are made and told. But let me give you just a couple of examples, chosen almost at random among many others, two cases you might or might not have heard of. The first case is I've just taken the salient features of them here to remind me of the basics. The first case is the Protag case. And Protag is a Kenyan renewable energy company that signed a 30-year concession agreement with Namibia to operate a solar power plant. And the project aimed at reducing Namibia's dependence on imported electricity and align with its national climate plan. The concession agreements had an ICCA clause, which referred to the settlement of disputes to the Cairo Regional Center for International and Commercial Arbitration, for setting up an arbitration under UNCITRAL. The seat is in Cairo, the language is English. And what's the dispute about? The dispute is that 4 years into the contract, the project, a change in governmental policy, introduces local content, quotas, and higher taxation on foreign-controlled energy companies. Protag invokes Namibia's breach of its obligation under the Southern Africa Development Community Investment Protocol, which provides for the usual protections against indirect expropriation, discriminatory measures, FETO, and all of that we all know too well. Namibia, in turn, claims that the new measures are part of its regulatory power to protect energy security and promote local industry, and that Protag failed to comply with environmental standards and local hiring commitment. So what happens? Well, the tribunal is set up with Tunisian international law professors chair, South African ISDS specialist, Namibian public law expert. What are the key elements? Well, the tribunal takes a very balanced, development-sensitive approach to the issue. It evaluates the legitimate expectations of the investor against the regulatory autonomy of the state. It applies the margin of appreciation standard to Namibia's development and industrial policy. Interestingly enough, amicus curiae are received because the tribunal wants to give the impression that other voices are being heard. And then comes the final word after 18 months. There's no finding of expropriation. Namibia's measures were deemed to be regulatory and not arbitrary. However, the fair and equitable treatment clause was found to have been violated, for Namibia did not consult Protag adequately and because it changed key regulations without transitional arrangements. Damages were awarded in the range of $15 million for loss of expected returns against $175 million claimed. And the tribunal encouraged the renegotiation of the concession agreement to reflect the new policies and to safeguard the project. So what's the moral of the story of the Protag case? Well, Namibia maintained its sovereign right to regulate in the public interest. It was provided with an incentive to improve investment governance and consultation processes, and it demonstrated its commitment to the rule of law and to international obligations. Protag, in turn, only had to pay a partial compensation. It preserved its long-term investment under revised terms, and it gained recognition for corporate adaptability and responsibility. And for Africa, what's in it for Africa? Well, it showed that African arbitration institutions and arbitrators can effectively handle ISDS cases. It reinforced the idea that African institutions can be neutral, competent, and trusted for ISDS, and it boosted confidence in Africa-centered dispute resolution. And the other case I want to speak about, it's very briefly the New Dawn case. And the New Dawn is a Gambian-based renewable energy company that entered a joint venture with SolarWave, a German solar technology firm, to construct a solar farm in Burundi. 2 years into the contract, New Dawn accuses SolarWave to delay the delivery of solar inverters, and SolarWave counterclaims that New Dawn misused the funds for the project and fails to comply with environmental standards. The project stalls, the parties initiate arbitration at the KIAC that you might have heard about. In fact, it's our host today. This is the highest value cross-border energy arbitration on the whole continent. Tribunal gets set up, Rwanda arbitrator as chair, Gambian energy law expert, German commercial arbitration lawyer. What are the highlights? That the tribunal refuses to grant emergency interim measures, pushing parties towards procedural cooperation. Expert testimony on solar energy and project finance are heard, both from Africa and from other parts of the world, and an extensive document production and disclosures is handled efficiently through a shared secure e-platform, the e-case management system that KIAC recently inaugurated, if I am not mistaken. So after 14 months comes the award. Solidway found 60% liable for delays due to technical shortcomings. New Dawn is ordered to repay part of the misallocated funds. Overall, the damage apportionment is done fairly, and the tribunal encouraged the parties to resume the project under a renegotiated contract with regular compliance reporting. So what's the impact of this second story? Well, it is quite clear that for Africa, it showed that KIAC's capacity to manage large-scale complex arbitration, the strength of arbitral institutions and arbitrators in Africa, and it reinforced trust in regional dispute resolution mechanisms. And for business as well, there is something to gain. It boosts investors' confidence in African legal frameworks. It encourages companies to keep dispute resolution within the continent. And it sparks interest in African seats of arbitration as viable, cost-effective, and fair. Now, I trust that we can put those two stories in the basket of the untold ones. But sometimes the best stories are those yet to be written, like the Protac and the New Dawn ones that I must confess I made up for the occasion. But to listen to these stories, to project ourselves as actually being the protagonists of these success stories, is empowering, I find, and profoundly motivating. They make you feel the potential for achieving something important for the continent, the institutions you represent, your own practice. Untold stories, even those yet to be written, can help understand better the realities we face and the challenges we have to meet. It's important to foreground the success stories and to set aside for a minute the deceptions and the bad experiences. Protect, in my silly example, stands for protagonists. Protagonists of our own stories, states with their overt or unexpressed concerns, practitioners with their professional culture and practices, appointing authorities with their responsibilities for creating and maintaining a durable culture of arbitration, listening to states and other actors, taking bold and forward-looking moves, suggesting avenues and paths to the business community and to states. And it is often the case that with empowerment comes responsibility, and this is inevitable, not least because in order to write stories that the public will buy and read, the narrator must be credible, as they say in literary studies. And it's the same in law. Those who write the script, interpret, and perform arbitration stories must be credible, meaning good, professional, competent, aware of their responsibility, skilled, morally irreprehensible, and so on and so forth. The stories we make, with the awareness of our professional duties and the sense of commitment to building an effective, durable, and fair culture of arbitration, well, these stories are stories of trust towards each other, towards other actors, are stories of confidence in institutions and their rules. And at some point, all these stories will be woven into a thread. And the thread will become the narrative, the new dawn looming through the horizon. Once the narrative of an autonomous, solid African arbitration practice is in place, this will naturally provide the structure against the background of which many other stories will be told. It will be the obvious place for embedding cases and events, the way in which they will be spoken, written, or thought about. Narratives are so important. They generate meaning, enable identities and institutions. Over time, they are internalized, and their authority and explanatory thoughts start being taken for granted, and they go without saying. One of my favorite quotes is for its depth and truthful character, is Robert Cover's Nomos and Narrative 1982, and I know it by heart because I like it so much. No set of legal institutions or prescriptions exist apart from the narratives that locate it and give it meaning. For every constitution, there is an epic. For every decalogue, there is a scripture. And once understood in the context of the narratives that give it meaning, the law becomes not merely a system of rules to be observed, but the world in which we live. And I trust that in much less time than you think, Africa could develop a solid and durable culture of arbitration, a culture which is considerate of the peculiarities of the continent, of the legal traditions of the continent, and that can adequately and fairly meet the demands of both states and the business community. Arbitration institutions and practitioners have their part to play, of course, and I have no doubt that they will responsibly and successfully discharge their responsibility and be part of the story. A story yet to be told, but for that very reason, replete with a sense of potential, hope, expectation. Definitely one story worthy of investing on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you. We have the next chapter, and maybe even the concluding chapter of the book on Untold Stories, but we don't want to conclude since we have other panels that are going to continue the narratives. I'm looking at the organizers. I think that we have come at the end of the time that was allocated to our panel. I don't know if you want to be flexible and give 5 minutes of Q&A. And Q&A means questions, not comments. So, yes. So if someone has, yes, please, sir. 2, 3 questions. Yes, please. Please, my brother, go ahead.
You've given us the untold story of the negotiation and investment. The unwritten story, there I say, was unread. Why is it that an African state would choose arbitration? Why would an African state choose arbitration under the AFCFTA that requires Why would an African state choose arbitration under the AFCFTA, which requires consent, while the dispute settlement body offers an appellate option? Doesn't it sound like the AFCFTA is going to be the deathbed of arbitration in Africa?
That's a very difficult question. I certainly don't work a lot for African states, but I think sometimes states, again, I think I'll relate this to capacity building. A lot of times, states take options that they don't really understand. They haven't really been prepared for, or they think they understand, but they have a misunderstanding. And I think that's why sometimes you find states in positions where it seems very counterintuitive to their own interests, but they end up going down that route thinking that it's going to help them, but essentially it doesn't. I'm not keen to say that the AFCCA is going to be the deathbed of arbitration. I think it's still evolving. I think there are several opportunities in there. Apart from the state-to-state mechanism, I think a lot of states are not happy with ISDS, and the After Investment Protocol presents an opportunity for us to have that rebalancing. So I think it's really an opportunity to recreate the ecosystem and not to kill it. So maybe perhaps we should have a more positive outlook towards the After Protocol rather than a negative outlook, because it presents an opportunity for us to create our own ISDS system, which can help us.
Last question. Saja, you want also? So, sir, and then Saja. Or maybe you can give the microphone to Saja, and then we'll go to you, and that's it. Thank you.
Oh.
The microphone was for Saja.
She decided just to give...
Oh, you offered your spot? No problem.
Okay, Barrister Akpen again from Cameroon. Like I said before, I'm new into the field of arbitration, but I have 2 questions. My first question is, when it comes to conflict of laws within the different, we know in Africa we have the different blocks, the CEMAC block, the ECOWAS, the ECA, and so on. When it comes to conflict of laws in terms of arbitration, how do you manage it? That's the first question. Then my second question is, we were talking about geopolitics, investment, and then arbitration. And we get to have clients for arbitration when there is an investment dispute between an investor in the state or any other party concerned. In the case of geopolitics, we are seeing the geopolitical shift in investment and the investing parties. You cited the cases of Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and the rest. Now, when there is a conflict between those investors, okay, they are adjusting their mining codes, their investment codes, and so on. And it is a problem to the investors. When you arbitrators and the judges in arbitrary tribunals sit, how do you address those issues? Do you address those investors as, do you invest those parties as investors or as exploiters? Let me explain why.
No, that's the question.
Yes.
That's the question.
Let me explain.
Please.
When it's my worry.
No.
I need to get an answer.
Yeah, but we have to be brief. Please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Given that the resources are in Africa, the investors in quotes are from abroad. We are poor. They are rich. Are they investors or exploiters? In which case, whose case are you handling? I have that worry.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you so much. Then, last but not least, brief question, please. Yes, sir.
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Samuel Adumako from Ghana. I agree with Ziad's point earlier about the fact that the problem may not necessarily be about arbitration, but about certain investment protection standards, which need to be renegotiated. But my question is, given the historical power imbalance between developed states and developing states, how practical is this going to be? Are there certain examples where developing states have been successfully been able to renegotiate these investment protection standards in the BITs? And secondly, if it's not practical, what is the role of arbitrators in reinterpreting some of these standards peculiar to Africa? Because we've talked about capacity building for African arbitrators and all that. So has the time come for African arbitrators to step up and possibly give new meanings to these investment protection standards, rather than just following the old NAFTA tribunal decisions, which were pro-investors?
Thank you. Who want to respond?
I'm looking at the faces, so I'll move quickly. I know we are overshot. I'll speak quickly and say, on the issue of conflict of laws, parties have the first stab. Parties to the agreement decide the rules and the substantive law, etc. So where in the absence of that, then the arbitrator can decide, and there's a system in which they decide. For instance, if there's a conflict of rules, but the arbitration is seated somewhere, you apply the nearest applicable standard. So parties usually have it in the agreement, but if it's not there, the arbitrator usually is the one who will decide and may invite parties to give submissions on that. On investors vis-a-vis exploiters, that is why we are saying, when now you're sounding like maybe you're the one who will do the next coup. Because the coup people, that's what they were thinking when they had the coup, and the first thing was to drive out the foreign investors, because in their opinion it was exploiters. And the whole idea here is, even if you're saying it's exploiters, do we have the machinery and the wherewithal in terms of technology to then turn this raw material that God gave to us on this continent to something that can bring that money? So we're benefiting in some way, except that now we're trying to see what the balance is, because these minerals have been here. How come we didn't exploit them then? That would be a question. So a balance, I think, in my opinion, is good. Successful negotiation of BITs. You've had the Nigeria Morocco BITs. If South Africa is one other country, I'd say Kenya is in the process. Off the top of my head, that's what I'd say quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. Ziad, a point?
No, I mean, I agree, obviously. I think it's the role of arbitrators, even in existing frameworks, is very important. And personally, I've always thought that arbitrators always need to be culturally sensitive and at the same time cognizant that when you're sitting as a member of a tribunal in an investor-state arbitration, your approach, you don't import the same approaches as in commercial arbitration, and you have to appreciate the specificities of the type of dispute before you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I think that we come now to the end of this very fascinating conversation. I would like to thank again very much the panelists for very, very stimulating and thought-provoking points. It was really a pleasure for me to moderate this panel, and many thanks again to the organizers for the invitation. So thank you again. Bravo.
Thank you, Prof. The untold stories are very interesting. They required the untold patience. Thank you so much for being patient. And now, please feel free to go outside and get some coffee, some juice. And our third panel, they'll keep us here for a very short time. They've agreed that they'll not keep us so long. So we're about to conclude with the third panel. And may I invite our moderator, Mr. Isaiah Bozimo. Please welcome and introduce your panel. Let the panelists also come along, and we'll be done in a few minutes. Please give our third panel a chance. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon. Well, I'm very much mindful of the temperature in the room, and depending on the ratio of coffee to ugali you consumed at lunch, attention is either going to be waning or holding. I hope it's going to be the latter of the two, and we'll do our very best to ensure that attention is being held. With that said, we've listened to very many untold stories of innovation, stories of disruption, stories of reform. But I think the key question for my panel is, what conversations are we going to be having in 10 years' time? Right? Are we going to still be on this runway of possibility, like the Honorable Attorney General said this morning, or are we going to be taken off? Are we going to be moving from the fiction to the realities of where we would like to be? And that is the question that these panelists will address. And they will do so from a number of different lenses, from the lens of the law and legal frameworks, from technology and infrastructure, from the perspective of culture and people. And I would invite you also to join in this conversation. Let's make it a two-way thing, because certainly we do not have all the answers, but what we hope to do is interrogate those very key points that will get us from where we are to where we need to be. So in 10 years' time when we reconvene, welcome, Prof. In 10 years' time when we have these conversations again, we can say quite credibly that yes, we have made significant advancements. My panelists, you will find their profiles at pages 14 and 15 of the conference document, so I'm not going to go into any big detail as to their very impressive profiles, but just to introduce by name from closest to furthest from me, my sister Sylvie Beboye Bongo, Jackwell Ferris, Bala, and Professor Kidane. Thank you very much indeed. So perhaps I'll start with Jackwell, if I may. I think a good place to start is the law and legal infrastructure. We've had a lot of conversations today in terms of reforms of different legislation. We've had conversations as to different case law that's coming out from jurisdictions, and undoubtedly, we would like to keep as many disputes within the African continent as possible. So if we take, for instance, the example from the United Kingdom, a recent press release shows that domestic and international arbitration contributes about £2.5 billion to the UK economy. That would have a significant impact here. Now, so what will it actually take beyond these legal reforms to have these arbitrations, particularly international, seated within the continent?
Thanks, Azaya. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully you're all not too tired. I know it's very late. You want to go and have a coffee or something stronger, so apologies for keeping you so late. I think if we reflect on what's actually happening on the ground from a continental perspective in arbitration, I speak from a South African perspective. So in the South African context, arbitration has always been part of the legal ecosystem or the dispute settlement marketplace. So a few weeks ago, we had an event with the Chartered Institute, and we actually spoke about how do we assist the courts, because the courts actually have a problem in the context of South Africa, where if you go to court today, you would most probably only be in court in 2032. So the judiciary is saying, how does arbitration and mediation assist in making sure that, because it's ultimately a service being rendered, whether it's through the court system, whether it's the arbitration or mediation. And about a month or a bit ago, so in April, our courts, or specifically the Johannesburg division, issued a directive where it made all disputes, specifically action proceedings, you need to go to mediation, compulsory, before you can even proceed with any other process to court. If you demonstrate that you can mediate, or you've tried to mediate and the mediation was unsuccessful, they will give you an earlier trial date. So that's just in the context of alternative dispute settlement and arbitration in the context of South Africa. But more broadly, if you look at, again, South Africa and other jurisdictions within Southern Africa, so Johannesburg has become, for various reasons, I think one of the preferred seats of arbitration on the continent, including international arbitration. And that is, as a consequence, and a number of speakers, I think, already has also ventilated this. If you look at the judiciary, oversight over the judiciary in terms of this, you wouldn't find the judiciary interfering in an arbitral process. They respect the autonomy and sanctity of if parties have agreed to arbitration, they respect it. If you look at from a facilities perspective, whether you go to Johannesburg or Cape Town, you have world-class facilities that supports that. Whether it is where you have the arbitration, the venue, whether it is other support facilities. So facilities are important. The others, from a legal capacity perspective, if you look at what's happening in South Africa, and this is over years of development, the specialization in skills, in particular in specialized areas, whether it's energy disputes, whether it's mining disputes, whether it's infrastructure disputes, whether it's more sophisticated disputes that are developing, and we'll hopefully go into much more detail on that. So that is what's required to ensure that we actually get more arbitration seated on the continent. And the other point is maybe if you look at the dynamics, so we typically, there's a debate, it's this bargaining power between the investor or the, not necessarily sometimes investor, but another commercial party that is part of a transaction. And if you have a bigger bargaining power, so if you're the investor, typically you would insist that the arbitration is seated in London or New York. So it's also capacitating your internal lawyers to be able to sit around the table to say why it should be Johannesburg, why it should be Kigali, why it should be Nairobi. And that's the proactive steps that we need to take to make sure that we get more arbitrations that are done on the continent. So that's just some of the opening remarks. Thanks, Cesar.
Thank you very much indeed, Jackwell. Sylvia, I'd like to come to you next, and I'd like to turn the focus, if I may, to technology and infrastructure. So Jackwell mentioned, in addition to some of the other initiatives in Johannesburg, the fact that there are facilities available that can accommodate international arbitration, and we're here in Kigali, very excellent facilities as well. But I'd like you to zoom out. Right, so the Kigali, Rwanda, South Africa are just 2 of 54 African nations. As a whole, and it probably goes to Professor Abdelwahab's question earlier this morning as to, are we actually ready to hold and host these disputes? So as a whole on the continent, what is your view? Where are we in terms of infrastructure and technology? Are we ready to host these disputes?
Thank you very much, Isaiah. I have first to thank ICCA KIAC for having me. It's a pleasure to be back in Kigali after 7 years. I've been here in 2018 for the first SOAS conference, so it's always a pleasure. To jump on into your questions, I would like maybe to have a sort of starting point. That is that, as you mentioned, Africa is made of 55 countries. And I remember this morning a participant was talking about the language barrier because we are 55 countries with 5 different regions, and the development of those regions is quite also different. You may see the difference in the English, French, Arabic, Portuguese, and Spanish Africa. And that is really important to mention that. And to come into your question, are we ready in terms of technology? I have to say that, first of all, the starting point of that question is really the COVID-19 that we experienced some years ago. And I know that all of us are now used with these Zoom meetings, these Teams meetings. We are having the virtual hearings and all those tools that we have. But to really stick on your point and what Professor Abdel Wahab was saying this morning, there are still some gaps that we have to address to be ready. And one of the speakers this morning focused on one important point that we maybe have to focus on when we talk about technology and our capacity of being ready for having arbitration in Africa. That is the maybe electricity problem. I'm focusing on it, and it's important because, as I was saying, we don't have the same development in Africa. We are in Kigali. We don't have electricity court, but maybe it's something that we have to address first. But because it's not really a problem which is discussed within this forum, we usually say, okay, Africa is ready, we have infrastructure, but we have to start from the ground. I'm coming from the Ohada region, and I'm from Cameroon, and we are electricity producer, but sometimes you may experience some electricity cut, which may be a problem when you have to deal with like virtual hearings or even a case management conference meeting. So maybe to cope out, we are ready maybe in terms of infrastructure, but we still have some, some people will say simple problem, but this problem, we have to address them. And if we don't address them, we can't say we are really ready to move forward into the international arbitration landscape. So that is the starting point, and maybe I will address some other gaps during the conversation.
Thank you, Sylvia. I mean, I think since we're in the process of sharing untold stories, I recall the first virtual arbitration we did, and to address that power point, because it's a real problem for us also in Nigeria. We had the grid power, a solar inverter, and a diesel generator. Just two backups in case the grid power failed. And I think we had about 4 different internet connections ready to go, just in case as well. But the electricity question is a good one to transition to, Prof, in terms of energy investment and the broader picture of the AFCFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. We heard from the previous panel from Professor Mbengwe that essentially, because of this semantics issue, we actually do not have a dispute resolution mechanism for investor-state dispute. And we also heard from the previous panel, I think it was Nanya's intervention, how important it is to have this stable and predictable dispute resolution mechanism as an aid to facilitate international trade. So given this absence, where does that leave us? Does that impact on credibility? How do we square the circle?
Professor McCann thought there was a coffee break, so he stepped outside. I saw him. I wish he stayed, because I think his group has been looking at the wrong issue. Because I think this is the untold story I'm going to be talking about. This is a story that everybody's afraid to talk about, which is, I think that ad hoc arbitration is incompatible with a multilateral substantive treaty. We know the Energy Charter, that's not exemplary, but people who've studied the history of ICCIT would know this. The reason why the Community of Nations decided to conclude the ICCIT Convention is because they weren't able to agree on a substantive multilateral treaty on investment. They were able to do GATT, and then, of course, subsequently evolved into WTO, and then the WTO has its own dispute resolution mechanism that was, up to a certain point, very successful. So if you think structurally and doctrinally, the most sound approach would be, if you have a common multilateral substantive treaty, you would have a judicial body to interpret and apply it. So I think arbitration in Africa has its own history. I'm not going to go into the details of that. And a lot of the politicians are afraid of committing to one or the other form of arbitration. But I think the right response might be to think about a judicial organ, a multilateral investment court with an appellate mechanism along the lines of the one that is being proposed in Europe. That way, you address a couple of important points. Now, I want to say this. There was a professor who resigned right after Congress amended the law that he's been teaching for 30 years. And when he was asked, why did you resign? He said, Congress repealed everything that I knew. So the AFCFTA protocol essentially repealed all substantive principles that we've been studying. Why? It's changed the formulation of just about every important principle. Indirect expropriation is redefined. FET is deleted. Some other provisions have been added. The problem is we don't know what they mean, and the most serious problem is they haven't told us who is going to tell us what they mean, because it doesn't have a dispute resolution mechanism. Therefore, having that court system, I have formulated what it might look like. I'm not going to say that now, but having that would actually not only tell us what these new principles mean, but also how they could be harmonized and reconciled with existing customary international law, all the profound jurisprudence that have been generated in the last 75 years. So that's really the way to think about. I think that might be the solution to the missing link there.
That's a very interesting perspective, and it reminds me of a conversation we had a few years ago as to the speaker at the time called it social embeddedness. The social embeddedness, the generations of values that we have as Africans and whether they're compatible with some of these standards like FET and other things, who interprets it for us. So, and I think it was Madeline's intervention this morning where Madeline spoke of our inherent nature of resolving outside the court system. This system of consensus building, and perhaps I can bring the conversation to Bala. Is there a tension between this system of international arbitration on the one hand and this idea of consensus building on the other hand? I'm sure in the PCA you may have some experience of this. Can they realistically sit side by side? And could that be a way forward for us to address some of the issues that Professor Kadane mentioned?
Thank you very much, Isaiah. I hope you can hear me. Is there a mechanism that brings together, if I understand you correctly, predictability of the system and consensus building, which, according to Isaiah's theory and Madeline's theory, is a cultural practice that exists on the African continent. So first, I would like to say, there appears to be a certain, and we're all aware of this, there appears to be a certain increased appreciation for traditional cultural values on the African continent in terms of dispute systems design. So an example that I understand very well is the Kenyan example. The Kenyan judiciary, I'm aware, has established a policy, created a policy that pays attention to informal justice systems, so traditional dispute resolution mechanisms and so forth. And is there globally, internationally, a mechanism that could bring on board these kind of procedural practices that we have? I'm not sure there's sufficient room in arbitration for that, because when it comes to investor-state arbitration, the investor wants predictability, the users want predictability, and they're very clear about efficiency and predictability, and there's very little room to innovate around that and say, oh, let's try this new cultural practice that we found among the Igbo people of Nigeria, for instance. But in state-state arbitration, or state-state disputes generally, there is room to innovate. And a very good example of that, sorry, I'm going to go beyond the African continent and give the example of the Timor Sea conciliation. So this was a conciliation between Timor-Leste and Australia about the delimitation of the maritime boundary between the two states. In 2016, Timor-Leste initiated a compulsory conciliation under UNCLOS against Australia, purely for the delimitation of the maritime boundary. But this compulsory conciliation was preceded by a lot of political history that started from when Timor-Leste was a colony of Portugal, gained independence in 1975, then became a territory that is controlled by Indonesia, then became a UN-administered territory, and then finally in 2002, many years later, gained its own independence. And during this time, there were a lot of treaties that were concluded between Australia and Indonesia, Australia and later Timor-Leste, about how to delimit the boundary that exists between what later became Timor-Leste and Australia. And while this was going on, while these political discussions were going on and these negotiations were going on, there were also two arbitrations that were initiated by Timor-Leste, where's our boundary, where does our territory start, and so forth. And in these complexities, in trying to find an answer, finally Timor-Leste decided to go to conciliation. And of course, by the time they got to conciliation, which feels like an upside-down way of approaching dispute resolution, by the time they approached conciliation, it was clear to the Conciliation Commission that there's great distrust between the parties, and what can they do? And Timor-Leste and Australia have held their positions very publicly. So the Conciliation Commission had to be creative in order to bring the parties together, and they took on various measures to do this. They did something they called confidence-building measures, which involved the Commission inviting the parties to terminate the arbitration proceedings that were going on, to terminate certain treaties that they thought were making the parties look backwards as opposed to forwards, and so forth. They also had certain procedural provisions, such as non-aggravation of a requirement that prescribes the aggravation of the dispute, which says, Timor-Leste and Australia do not make this, don't widen the dispute, don't make it any worse than it already is. And in that sense, they went beyond what we traditionally know as an international law mechanism that tries to design a dispute resolution mechanism, and created some creative way of the parties coming together. Now, if you look at the report, you'll see that the Commission pays a lot of, appreciates all these efforts that it made that, in retrospect, really brought the parties together. Now, how do you reconcile cultural practices that, you cannot bring into international arbitration and so forth, but then you really want to create something that's your own, that's, as a people of the African nation, or as, Kikuyus or Igbo people? And I think the answer lies in conciliation. So this long story is to say, the answer lies in conciliation.
Interesting. I'll come back to you in a moment on whether that could be transferred to perhaps enforcement mechanisms. Don't be nervous. I'll be gentle. But Jacques, let me return to you briefly. You described the very many laudable things that are happening in Johannesburg in terms of the court support, in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the reform as well in the overarching legal framework. Okay, question. We've had this conversation before, right? You are doing excellent things. Many other jurisdictions are doing excellent things. Why is the legal system, as we see it, improving, yet we're not seeing this commensurate increase in the number of arbitrations? Forget South African connected arbitrations. We're not seeing international arbitrations, for instance, no South African connection, Nigerian party will sit in Joburg, right? What is the problem? What more beyond the legal infrastructure do we need to do? Is it a trust issue? Is it a perception issue? So we're not having the same conversation in 10 years.
I think it's fundamentally a perception and trust issue. Oh. I think fundamentally it gets down to perception and trust. So if I have to advise a South African party to include in a dispute settlement clause or arbitration clause that the seat of arbitration is Lagos, Nigeria, I will find it very difficult, very, very difficult to convince bar South African party, any other client, to select Lagos as a seat. And the question would be, what other seats are there? So it's, I think from a continental perspective, we look at, so there's Johannesburg, Kigali, Nairobi, Mauritius, Cairo, and say Lagos. So it's also then ensuring, so if I have to convince someone to use Lagos as a seat of arbitration, it's being able to be capacitated to say what's happening in Nigeria that would allow me so both the legal framework, the judicial oversight, the infrastructure obviously plays a fundamental role, but to convince a client, why should I select Lagos? And as I say, by default, I think we have internally in the firm, and this is some of the untold stories, we have a concerted effort to ensure that we do select African institutions. And a checklist in terms of why would you select either Kigali or Nairobi or Johannesburg. So it's developing those to make sure that you can also capacitate again your lawyers to be able to say, when someone on the other side of the table sits there saying, no, we should use Singapore, not that there's anything wrong with Singapore, but if you want to have those arbitrations on the continent, you must be able to capacitate, not just the disputes, not about the disputes lawyers, it's about the transactional lawyers who are sitting there negotiating, because for any client or commercial contracting party, for them the dispute settlement clause is actually the last thing they think about. It's if we settle the terms, great, we're getting the money, there's a new shareholder coming in, it's the last thing they think about. So it's ensuring, for me, fundamentally capacitating the transactional lawyers that are sitting around on the table from an African perspective, or the African lawyers, to be able to say, why should we have Johannesburg or Nairobi or Kigali or Cairo as the seat of arbitration. And then also the clients must also be capacitated to say why they should be pushing back to say, no, you don't have to go to London, you can actually go to Port Louis. So it's all about capacitating the transactional lawyers, but fundamentally, in my view, also the clients to say why and how. And that's where we're going to see more. And we've seen the efforts pay off. Again, I'm using Johannesburg as an example, but by pushing by the big corporate law firms, and I call them the big 5 law firms in South Africa, pushing back and saying you will use Johannesburg, and we've seen more international disputes happening in Johannesburg. You can see that from the statistics. If you pull the statistics of AFSA International, there are significant disputes happening in Johannesburg, where it's not just African, intra-Africa parties, but it's also where we're currently acting for a German company against a South African company under the AFSA international rules. So it's about doing those things, being very concerted, and we need to be assertive, more assertive.
Can I ask a follow-up? just one follow-up. So we're looking at this, or we've been looking at it from an international arbitration perspective. There is a significant amount of domestic arbitration, and of course I'm interested to hear what the other panelists have to say on this. But there is a significant amount of domestic arbitration that is going on within all these jurisdictions, high-value, sophisticated parties that go on to generate a body of case law that add to the general jurisprudence of a given jurisdiction. Are we doing enough, or let me phrase it this way, could that be a way of bridging this information gap, showing that there is actually a body of law existing in this jurisdiction based on domestic decisions, or do you think that is insufficient?
No, I definitely think so. So if you look at my practice and a lot of practices in the South African law firms, so there's actually a significant arbitration practice specifically built around commercial disputes with sophisticated clients who are either, so South African clients who are also listed in London and Johannesburg or New York that have disputes, significant disputes, whether in the resource sector, in the energy space, in other infrastructure space that happens there. So I would think the domestic arbitrations are the fundamental training grounds for international arbitrations also, or for those who want to go into international arbitration, because it fundamentally sets the basis for an arbitration practice, because obviously there's different rules that are applicable to international arbitrations, but the fundamentals remain the same, whether it's a domestic or international arbitration. And there is a lot of arbitrations happening. And most, by the way, actually, most arbitrations people also from a South African, I think it's a continental issue where ad hoc arbitrations are also preferred because they view institutional arbitrations as expensive, even in the context of EFSA. It's expensive. We have to pay all these deposits every time we need to get an award, when we need to do X, Y, and Z. So there's a big ad hoc arbitration practice. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I don't know if any of the other panelists wanted to make an intervention on that. Sylvie.
Yes, maybe to jump in on what Jackwell was saying, I would like to maybe respond to your question in giving the OHADA perspective, because we haven't mentioned it a lot today, and this is also one of the points we have to address when it's come to speak about African arbitration. We still have this barrier in Africa, and I think it's a problem because I was listening to Jackwell, and I was saying to myself, oh, he's mentioning just Kigali, Rwanda. I haven't heard about Abidjan, Douala, other cities. You see, this barrier is a real problem in African arbitration. And I use, and you know we have this kind of conversation. Sometimes you will see my neighbors from Nigeria, they will look for lawyers in Paris while we are there in Cameroon, Abidjan, Niger, and we are applying the civil law we inherited from the European, the colonialism we were talking about today. So just to jump in and to come into the OHADA region, I have to say that, and this is a study which was made by Emilia, we have about 18 arbitration institutions in Africa today. And in the OHADA region, which is made of 17 countries, we have at least 2 or 3 arbitral institutions. That means that we have a lot of local arbitral institutions which give rise also to our court to look into arbitration matters. We have a lot of award annulment. We have also the CCGA, which is the Common Court of Justice of an Arbitration, which is knowing about a lot of arbitration cases because since the reform in 2017, if the court, the national court, did not take a decision within 3 months, these have to be reported to the CCGA. So there is really today even local and even regional, a big regional arbitration practice within the OHADA arbitration landscape. And this is really something which is useful for us, because if you start with local arbitration and if our judges are used to know about local arbitration, so they will be also able to deal with international arbitration cases when it comes to enforcement, for example. So maybe to add on what Jagwal was saying, that's what I can add concerning the arbitration, local arbitration practice and also the regional one.
Thank you. I think what is interesting from both of your interventions is the fact that we have so much going on in the individual regions, but those outside the region might not necessarily be aware of it. So perhaps the conversation we need to be having is how can we take a more cohesive approach in terms of establishing perhaps even a constellation of seats across Africa that will translate to international arbitrations. But Bala, if I may come back to you, the consensus building point is an interesting one for me. Interesting because I recall, this is not an arbitration issue, but I recall when I was briefly in government, and we had a series of disputes between two communities, which eventually went up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court gave a judgment, and the losing community refused to implement it. They were like, you cannot impose a decision of people who are not, they don't understand my ancestral home. So that's why this consensus building idea is quite interesting to me, given the nature of some of the disputes that arise. Now, from an international arbitration perspective, most national laws would default to the tribunal deciding strictly according to law, unless a party has agreed. So do you see a place where we can have some procedural flexibility in terms of getting to that promised land, in introducing this consensus process in the international arbitration or even domestic arbitration space?
I'll speak about international arbitration. I'll say yes and no. Yes, to the extent that, for instance, Article 1.1 of the UNCITRAL rules specifically provides that to the extent that the parties do not agree, then these rules will apply. So if the parties agree something else, then they will modify the rules as they agree. So the parties can decide to modify the rules as they deem fit, and where the dispute, say, involves a state or a state entity entrusted with the protection of public land, public policy, some kind of public trust, then they can propose to the tribunal to modify the rules or the procedure of the arbitration in such a way that it accommodates these people, yeah? And that is also reflected in Article 17 of the UNCITRAL rules, which says that, the tribunal has the discretion to carry out the procedure as they deem fit, as long as, equality of parties and all of that stuff is taken into account. So in principle, yes, there are ways of doing this. In practice, again, it would be difficult, particularly for such things as investment arbitration. Although we have seen, for instance, in Kotek Mining versus Kenya, where subliminally you can see that there are certain points of cultural considerations about, Mrima Hill, and Mrima Hill is the dispute was about a mining license in the coastal area of Kenya, where there's a place called Mrima Hill that is considered a cultural monument and is used for religious practices. Although, of course, the tribunal did not go into the details of, what are these religious practices? Let us get these people to talk to us about it. But there is a possibility, because we see these things in the disputes, and there is a possibility for that. In state-state arbitration, I think interstate arbitration is where there's greater flexibility. Because number one, the rules of procedure are decided by the tribunal and the parties. So they create everything, sort of from scratch. Of course, based on experiences and practices that they've had, but at least from scratch. So you can modify things as you deem fit. And in the SPLM, the ABI arbitration, so that was SPLM versus Sudan, there were instances where the tribunal thought it is important to have the communities who are affected by the question of the ABA boundary to say, please come in and, participate in the hearings, even as observers or even as non-participating party representatives. So you have these chiefs from all these tribes coming in to listen in on the proceedings, and also being there, their word rendering ceremony and all of that. So there are opportunities to do that, but we will face certain difficulties if we try to bring it into commercial arbitration. There will definitely be some difficulties. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to stay for a moment with ISDS, and I'll come back to you, Prof. You mentioned in your first intervention this discomfort in the ISDS system, primarily because of the way certain standards are interpreted. Where does that discomfort come from? Because I don't think ISDS is going to go away, particularly if AFCFTA is fully implemented. But where does that discomfort come from? Is it by is it legal design? Is it this perception of a power imbalance between the parties? And more importantly, how can we address the skepticism going forward?
It's a difficult question, but I've had the opportunity to study many of the African ISDS matters, especially those. I think I read all the ISDS awards published in English involving African states, and I've profiled 30 of them in my book. I tried to understand exactly why the African states are discomforted, and I think it comes primarily from the composition of the decision makers and the African states' perception that they are somewhat culturally disadvantaged. So if I can cite some statistics, of the 30 cases that I've profiled in my book, these cases were decided by 88 arbitrators. Among the 88 arbitrators, there were only 4 Africans, and there were only 4 women. So there was a significant diversity deficit. That does not necessarily lead to wrong or unjust outcome. What I've noticed from actually studying these cases is, for the first couple of decades, the Africans didn't even participate in these proceedings. Many of these decisions were actually default decisions. But once the Africans started participating, starting around 2004 with the World Duty Free case, Kenya. Then, if you look at the statistics since 2010, more than 50% are actually won by African states, once they have participated and represented properly. And I have not noticed any particular substantive provision that has been the source of the dissatisfaction. And a lot of times people talk about the FET being one of the most serious issues. I can pronounce, having studied 30 cases at least now, I haven't really seen FET being the most serious problem that runs across all these 30 cases. But in any case, when the Africans got together, for whatever reason, they didn't think that they were treated equally, and started negotiating regional treaties, they started tampering with some of the most established basic principles of law, culminating in the Pan-African Investment Code. And I don't know if Professor Makan has returned. And then, of course, now we have a protocol without an investment tribunal or a court or some type of dispute resolution mechanisms. So we have a number of new provisions inserted in these provisions. Investor obligation, anti-corruption, labor, all of those. But the mechanism of interpreting and applying to them does not exist, right, as I said earlier. So yes, there is discomfort. And of course, all of these substantive provisions emerged out of some type of resentment. That's not the right kind of motive to be legislating, right? So we have some very serious development in the area of substantive law. We don't have the mechanism of interpreting and applying them. Now, of course, the AFCFTA protocol is stuck somewhere because of history. And they mentioned earlier about, I think it is the geophysics I think it's probably a geotempora because I don't believe the politicians have had enough time to actually study, understand why the problem emerged, and try to resolve those problems. So you have a political decision, a political instrument. I don't know how it's going to be interpreted. I suspect and I predict that there's going to be significant jurisprudential problem once it started being implemented. I would like to say one more thing, please, which is, you know, when you were very young, when the big guy beats you up, you're so angry that you take it out with the little guy. So what happened in the investment protocol is all the dissatisfaction that Africa had is taking it out against its own neighbors, right? This is intra-Africa. It's so not very investor-friendly, but it affects only those Africans who are investing in Africa. I think that's the most fundamental flaw of the African protocol, and not to mention the absence of the dispute resolution mechanism.
Thank you very much indeed. One thing you mentioned that still sticks with me is the idea of implementation. I've always said many jurisdictions, including mine, has a gap between laying down policy and implementing policy. And irrespective of how good your policy is on paper, essentially your policy is what you implement. So Sylvie, if I can come back to you, for instance, if your policy is that we are an arbitration-friendly jurisdiction, yet in your earlier intervention we are aware that we have infrastructure problems in terms of internet connectivity, in terms of infrastructural deficit, in terms of electricity, I think you mentioned, yet we are not doing anything about it, right? Firstly, how do we expect to grow? But more importantly, where is the problem coming from? Is it a funding problem? Is it a lack of political will problem? And how do we get over this?
Thank you, Isaiah. I think I will address the question in 3 points because I think the problem is everywhere for me. First is the political will, really. Because if we address the electrical problem, I was talking at the beginning of my intervention, this is a political will because if our state does not invest in electricity, because we have, in Cameroon, for example, I will speak from the perspective of my country, of what I know most, we have energy. But we don't understand that, and that is one of the untold story I will tell today. I won't be very scientific. It's just that you are at an hearing or you are at a case management and you have a power cut. You don't know. You have to run and for the power supply, and after you don't even see people anymore. This is a really problem and is a political problem. And I think the second problem also is institutional. Most of our arbitration centers are sometimes created by chambers of commerce and industries or employers' organizations, and they are linked to them, so sometimes they can't take their decision personally. I can see from the OHADA perspective mainly, you have arbitral institution which cannot have websites, and this is a problem. If we want to across feasibility, we have to have websites. I remember sometimes people calling me because they can't get someone into an arbitral center, which is a problem. So I think also from the institutional perspective, there are questions to be addressed. And the last point maybe will be from the user's perspective. We as users, as council and even users like companies or individuals, we are also, we do also have a responsibility. I remember I was sitting in a case and it was the deadline, and the council sent me his submissions, and by WhatsApp, you know, really pictures. I was like shocked, and we can see it from now when you just send a message. The person will send you a very important document by WhatsApp. We don't address some like cyber security. We don't really think about this kind of problem. So I think the problem is really in a very high scale from our state, institutional, and also from the user perspective.
Thank you, Sylvie. So I hear you saying that there's also a capacity issue to be addressed here. Okay, I'm reading the temperature in the room, and my intention was for the panel to give you or leave you with food for thought. But I fear that if we carry on much longer, we might leave you with thoughts of food. So I would at this stage invite questions from the audience, if there are indeed any. I think the thoughts of food are definitely creeping in. Okay, to the extent that, oh yes, there's a question over here. I think the microphone is coming. Yes.
So throughout the day, I think we heard about how this whole discussion about sovereignty and the African continent is playing a big role for the molding of international relations. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not working on an international arbitration field. I come from the international criminal justice field. And a lot of what I heard resonated with me about this issue of rebulking the international institutions and creating this own African perspective of it. So I would like to ask the whole panel about whether this is a zoom-out problem and if this is more a sovereignty and international relations problem, or if this is focusing too much on international arbitration. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Prof, I think you might be best placed to take this one, at least the first shot at this.
Thank you. Yes, I think partly it is a question of asserting one's sovereignty. And also, African institutions, I think, are increasingly gaining acceptance and also asserting their agency and autonomy. But a lot of work remains to be done. One of the things that I've noticed recently is, for example, in a set-aside, in arbitral awards that have been set aside in African jurisdictions, or for that matter, in almost every developing country, courts in the developed advanced economies, such as in Washington, D.C., are more likely to actually deny them recognition. An excellent example is the PNID case. The PNID case was initially set aside in Lagos, but the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals had difficulty recognizing that set aside, regardless of there was Kromoloy v. Egypt, and they started in 1984, and there was a case called Termo-Rio. They had actually retracted that before, but now there's a Nigerian court setting aside an arbitral award that was principally cited in London, but once the UK High Court set it aside, then it got kind of some type of attention. So it's about gaining respect, just like every sphere of life. Are African institutions respected? Is anything that's done in Africa respected and recognized? I think that's part of the sovereignty and autonomy.
Thank you very much indeed, Prof. Did any other panelists want to make a contribution to this? Okay, I'll just pause to see if there are any other questions from the audience. Okay, to the extent that there are none, I'll just ask a final question to each of the panelists. And I'll start with Prof and work my way down. If you could make one policy change that would change the conversation going forward, so we're having a very different and positive conversation in 10 years' time, what would that be?
I have a very straightforward answer to this question. I would set up an African Court of International Investment.
Thank you very much.
And yes.
Please continue.
And one more thing.
Yes.
I would not limit it to intra-Africa. Once it gained some type of respect, I would not limit appointment to Africans only so that it can gain some kind of acceptance. I would put the most prominent names on it, be very attractive. It starts with intra-Africa, and then the inter-African, the outside world could actually, once it's respected it, be putting it in treaties and agreements that it would resolve their dispute. So that would be my submission.
Thank you very much. And the same question to Bala.
I would put in place a policy that encourages conciliation. This goes from my very first presentation, because I think, personally, that that is where we can exercise a lot of creativity, given the informal nature of the proceedings, given, you know, it's not limited only to questions of law. We can go into questions of culture and all this, and interest and all of these things that don't necessarily limit us to international law. And I think in that way, we would be able, as African users, we would be able to assert ourselves in the dispute resolution mechanism. So I would put in place a policy for conciliation.
Thank you very much. Jaco?
There's so many to think about, but I think maybe from an investment perspective, it will have to be, say, consistency and uniformity between how we treat foreign investors and how we treat our own investors, because I think a number of people have already articulated that there's a sense of double standards also. So if you look at the AFCFTA and you look at some BITs, there's actually more expected of African investors and less, to some extent, expected of foreign investors if you look at the old generation BITs. And I use a specific example of Namibia. If you look at why there's an influx of investment in Namibia, there's all these old generation BITs and all the Germans are going there. But, and they don't have the New York Convention, they're not a member of ICCA and all of those things. But because they have more rights than a South African investor. It's uniformity.
Got it, uniformity. And finally, Sylvie.
I would simply continue what we have been doing since 30 years within OHADA, because this is a good example of integration between 17 African countries, and I think we have to continue. There are things to be improved, but it's a good example of what we can do within Africa.
Thank you very much indeed. And with that, I would invite you to give these wonderful panelists a round of applause. Thank you also for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isaiah. You've been generous with your time. In fact, you've used less than the allocated time. Thank you so much for being supportive. So, yes, you're welcome, Liz. Thank you. And I think I'll not come back after Liz. I'll invite our closing keynote speaker to come right through. I'll come after her. Thank you so much.
Could we ask those who are in control of the slides to put up our slide with our QR code so that we can make our exciting announcement? Courtney, Paula, who's in charge of the slides? Excellent, fantastic. So good afternoon again. Together with Danga Kamal, who's one of ICCA's governing board members and a member of our African Working Group, we are going to take a small step backwards in order to be able to take several steps forward. At first, we ask you to take out your phones and download the link through this QR code that's on the screen in front of you. One of the few times that we actually ask you to use your phones in a conference situation. So what you've now downloaded is one of ICCA's newest projects. It's been developed under the umbrella of our African Working Group and intends to reveal even more untold stories from the continent in the form of untold histories. This is a project nearly 10 years in the making. It started off with research done by ICCA into historic African dispute resolution processes. It's a project that was largely driven by Judge Abdul Kai Yusuf of the ICJ and of the ICCA Governing Board, and has ended up in the creation of a full-scale searchable database of pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial arbitrations and conciliations on the continent. And this has become the resource that we're very happy to announce today. We're calling it ICCA's Historical Database of African Dispute Resolution. So what you'll find in the database are interstate, investor-state, and international commercial arbitrations and conciliations. All the decisions included are African by nature in that they either involve an African party, whether private parties or rulers or governments or former colonial powers, or they concern African interests, including peoples, territories, resources, investments, or some form of commercial or sovereign investments. The scope is broad, and I'm going to hand over to Dunga to give you a sense of some of the stories that are already included in the database. Dunga.
Thank you very much, Lisa. As the ICCA Bureau will tell you, I find it quite difficult to contain my enthusiasm for this project. I think it's fantastic, and the Bureau has done incredible work under Lisa's leadership, but I'll save the thank yous for the end and give you a taste of the kind of work that this remarkable group of people has done. So as the ICCA team has been gathering these cases, they've been uncovering untold stories, which is the theme of this conference. They've found forgotten histories, they've found little-known geographies. Now, the earliest case that the database contains is the award in the Pottendick case, which dates to 30th of November, 1843. This was a dispute between France and Great Britain about certain measures that France had taken to blockade the port at Pottendick. The arbitrator in that case was Frederick William, King of Prussia, and the instrument that they relied on was the Treaty of Versailles of 1785. And this example, this oldest example, typifies the type of cases that the team has found, mostly from the 19th century, mostly between colonial powers. But those are not the only types of cases that the team has found. Another example takes us from the west coast of Africa to the east, and this is a dispute between two brothers, who are the Sultan of Oman and the Sultan of Zanzibar. They were the sons of Said, who was himself the Sultan of Muscat and Sultan of Zanzibar. He held both titles. And on his death, these brothers could not agree on how to divide his territories in Asia and in Africa. So they called on the help of Lord Canning, who was the Viceroy of India, Viceroy and Governor General of India, to resolve their dispute. And he resolved it in a letter, never met the parties, never went to the territories where he decided, on whose fate he decided, but he did send an emissary, Lieutenant Cochran, who went to do the necessary inquiries in the relevant territories. And there's an exchange of letters between the arbitrator and these two brothers, the result of which is that they accept his decision. Now, here we see there was no involvement at all of the Zanzibari people, or indeed any African involvement. But that was not always the case in the cases that the team has found. We see an example in Southern Africa, going to the south, where we have a dispute between the Republic of South Africa, Transvaal, and the Griqua and Tswana people. And this was a territorial dispute about a boundary in very diamond-rich lands. Again, very short awards, definitely worth looking at. Again, here the arbitrator was not African. And the instrument was a special agreement between the disputing parties, which again typifies the type of instruments that we see in these cases, compromis or special agreements between the disputing parties where a treaty does not otherwise exist. We do, however, see in some instances some African arbitrators. There's an example of two unnamed Ethiopian arbitrators in a 5-member panel in a dispute which was the case on the attack on the caravan of the Maharao of Kutch of 1927. Now, what type of dispute resolution mechanisms do we see in these cases? We see arbitration, obviously, but we also see conciliation, and we also see claims commissions. And we don't have time to go into examples, but these relate to sometimes destruction of property after the Second World War or the division of territories just before independence. The type of legal principles that are in these cases or that are being uncovered in these cases include older legal principles such as capitulation, annexation, uti possidetis, but we also see more familiar principles like expropriation and fair and equitable treatment. The kind of topics covered include boundary delimitation, state responsibility, sovereignty, the rights of local populations, commercial issues, compensation, hearsay, impartiality of arbitrators, and so forth. The team, as you will see, those who've managed to get to the website, has done an incredible job to make sure that this database is easily navigable. And you can search using different criteria, such as the legal instrument, the arbitrators, the territories, occupying powers, time periods, and the methods of dispute resolution. You will see that the language of the awards is English and French. This is the original language of the awards. And this, I think, reflects what we've heard throughout the course of today, that there is plurality in languages in Africa, and this we see also in the language of the decisions in the arbitral awards. You'll see also that the teams have meticulously tagged the different awards, which makes this search function easy, and have provided, for your ease of reference, a brief summary of each dispute. I'll hand back to Lisa.
So today we have about 50 older historical decisions already in the database, but that's just the beginning. We've identified around about 600 African conciliations and arbitrations, all of which will be uploaded in the coming months, including a healthy selection of decisions by the mixed commissions for the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade of the 19th century, which will be uploaded in a separate section of the database. We've already benefited from the work of Judge Yusuf, from Dunga, from Paula Baldini, from Courtney Kemp, from Lucy Burns in getting to launch. And going forward, we intend to engage local researchers. We intend to go into local repositories of on the continent that keep historic records. We intend to go into the archives of the former colonial powers in order to retrieve secondary materials that are relevant. But of course, you and your colleagues are our greatest resource, so we encourage you to go into the database, have a look around, explore to see which stories that you may recognize, and let us know if there are stories that you would like to share with us. We hope that it will be a useful database, a useful resource for anyone who's interested in African dispute resolution. It's somewhat academic, but I think the underlying philosophy is, how can we tell positive stories of our future unless we understand the histories from which we come from? So please enjoy and use it, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. I've been asked by our MC to introduce our final keynote speaker. It is a great pleasure, as always, to introduce to you Funke Adekoya, who has been a long-time member of the ICCA governing board, is now on the ICCA advisory board, and has been a key member of the African working group, and has helped us to develop new perspectives and to expand greatly our work on this continent and beyond. So, Funke, over to you.
Africa and international arbitration, untold stories. Distinguished delegates, colleagues, and friends, it's a great honor to stand before you at the conclusion of this remarkable conference. I must begin by thanking ICCA for proposing an African venue, for its non-Congress year meetings, and for collaborating with KIAC to organize this conference here in Kigali. Our interaction today has provided us with the opportunity to reflect and learn from our diverse and previously unexpressed viewpoints. Throughout the day, we have listened to our untold stories from many perspectives. The launch of ICCA's historical database of African dispute resolution showcases the previously unknown or undiscussed engagement of African actors and African issues in international law. We have heard about the potential effect on international arbitration of the ongoing legal reform efforts in different countries on the continent. We've heard about Africa's economic prospects, challenges, and opportunities for commerce, trade, and investment. They've all been analyzed, as well as the potential impacts of technology, culture, law, and legal instruments on disputes arising from the African continent. As we conclude this conference today, we must remember that the theme, Africa and International Arbitration, Untold Stories, is more than a slogan. It serves as a call for awareness, for recognition, and for action. It urges us to reconsider how Africa should be perceived in international arbitration, not as a passive subject of disputes, but as a continent rich in leadership, knowledge, and contributions. We must recognize that for far too long, the prevailing narratives in international arbitration have either marginalized Africa or reduced it to a single story, concentrating on themes of political or economic risk, the fragility of government structures, or less than ideal court systems. However, the silence in the global discourse does not result from a lack of substance. Rather, it emerges because those with valuable insights have not always been heard. And today we've had the opportunity to listen to just a few of those voices. The settlement of disputes through mediation and arbitration is a culturally African method of dispute resolution. However, external legal frameworks have been imposed on the arbitration structures to which we are customarily and culturally accustomed, crystallizing into highly formalized and structured international arbitration dispute settlement regimes. These systems were not designed for our contexts, yet African states and practitioners have had to operate within them, sometimes with success, but seldom with genuine ownership. The lack of ownership is confirmed by the statistics released annually by major arbitral institutions. African arbitrators are still underrepresented in the data on appointments, and when they are appointed, such appointments typically involve disputes concerning African parties. While a minuscule few African arbitrators have been appointed in cases with no connection to Africa, in most cases, those appointments have been made by the appointing authority rather than by the parties involved. These appointments, in fact, are the exception that prove the rule. Then again, in African-based disputes, African seats are underutilized, with most proceedings being held in London, Paris, or Geneva, depending on whether the dispute arises from Anglophone or Francophone Africa. Additionally, African parties are often represented by foreign counsel in proceedings conducted in foreign capitals under foreign arbitration rules. However, some untold stories illustrate the potential for a different narrative. An Africa where governments confidently assert their ability to defend themselves in arbitration proceedings with integrity and success. Consider, for instance, the ministries of justice in Kenya and in Ghana, which are developing internal legal capacity to effectively defend high-stakes arbitration claims, sometimes without recourse to foreign legal counsel. These are not merely bureaucratic victories. They are strategic acts of sovereignty, ensuring that the public interest is robustly protected by local expertise. These ministries have not just endured international arbitration. They are crafting a new story for Africa in the international arbitration arena. That is a story worth telling and worth retelling. Werner Myers, a leading diversity and inclusion expert, said, I quote, "Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance." Applied to the relationship between Africa and international arbitration, this suggests that our inclusion depends on being invited by the system's owners. The internal capacity that the ministries of justice in Kenya and Ghana are developing demonstrates that they are no longer waiting to be invited to dance. They are choosing the music. Across the continent, African legal talent is flourishing. From Lagos to Kigali to Nairobi, from Cairo to Cape Town, we have counsel and arbitrators who are not only capable by any global standard, but are also recognized as such. Similarly, we also see African arbitration institutions rising in their ambition and in their professionalism. The Kigali International Arbitration Center, the African Arbitration Association, the Lagos Court of Arbitration, the Cairo Regional Center for International Commercial Arbitration, and others are promoting and actively acquiring the required skills that will anchor trust in homegrown processes and confirm that quality does not need to be outsourced. Finally, we must recognize the power of the next generation, the young practitioners, researchers, and academics promoting new ideas, challenging old assumptions, and digitizing access to international arbitration in ways that were unimaginable just a decade ago. What happens next is up to us. The future of international arbitration is not fixed. It is something we can shape. We must continue to reclaim the narrative. African arbitration stories should not only emerge when something goes wrong, they should be visible in everyday practice, exemplifying knowledge, excellence, and leadership. We can start by advocating for more African-seated arbitrations, but not merely for symbolism, but for substance. There is no justifiable reason for disputes involving African parties governed by African laws and concerning African projects to be resolved exclusively outside the continent. However, this can only be achieved when we, as lawyers responsible for drafting the arbitration clauses in the contracts that may lead to disputes, advocate for an African seat, or at the very least, advocate for an African venue for any ensuing arbitration proceedings. At the same time, we must continue to build capacity while recognizing and trusting in the capacity that already exists. We need our governments to invest in local expertise. We need more universities to teach arbitration in context and more mentoring networks to support young arbitration counsel so they can match the expertise of their Western-based colleagues. It is when we have done this that we can hold our partners and institutions accountable. It is time for arbitral tribunals to look more like the world they judge, and time for arbitral appointments to reflect global diversity, not global hierarchy. How often are our African colleagues appointed as arbitrators in disputes between non-African parties? Colleagues, the perspectives that we have shared today matter, but they cannot end here. As we leave this conference, we must not return to business as usual. Let us go back to our respective destinations as custodians of these untold stories, but ready to write new ones, louder, prouder, and on our own terms. Because Africa's role in international arbitration is not a subplot. With the vast expanse of minerals that will power the world's new technologies, I venture to say that in the years ahead, disputes from the mining sector and the mining industry will make Africa central to the international arbitration narrative, just as some European countries have recently become central to disputes in the alternative power technology sector. We need to be prepared to play our proper role should a similar scenario arise. As Shirley Chisholm famously said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. I thank you for your attention, and I wish us all journey mercies to our respective destinations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Funke. Thank you so much. Today we had a very ambitious program, very packed, and I thank you all for your support. Thank you so much for supporting us, ourselves. We are only late a few minutes, and the Secretary General of KIAC has a way of is going to compensate. But before we set ourselves for the reception that ICCA and KIAC has prepared for us, allow me to invite the Attorney General of the Republic of Malawi to just say a few things, and then I'll invite the Secretary General of KIAC to tell you in detail of what he's going to treat you. Thank you. Welcome, Honorable Attorney General of the Republic of Malawi. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think the Secretary General has hijacked. I thought I would speak in the morning. I'm really sorry, I think, to speak at the end of the session when he had prepared to go for, I think, the program indicates an evening cocktail. And I thought one of the messages was supposed to go to the Chief Justice and the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice, whom we have shared a long journey history together for the past four years. Distinguished guests, esteemed members of the judiciary, I saw the Chief Justice, respected legal practitioners, valued colleagues from public and private institutions, the sponsors, ladies and gentlemen. And today, of course, I see from the program, even tomorrow, these are more than an event. It is a powerful expression of Africans' commitment to capacity building in arbitration. The days reflect a continental awakening, an affirmation that the time has come for Africa not only participate, but shape the global arbitration narrative. It is with profound honor and deep sense of duty that I arrive to address this distinguished assembly at the ICCA, you call it ICCA or ICCA KIAC International Arbitration Conference, held here in the heart of Kigali, Rwanda, affectionately known as the Land of Southern Hills. This gathering is more than a convening legal professionals. It is a convergence of visionaries and custodians of Africa's evolving justice architecture. Together, we stand at the frontier of a transformative moment, one in which we are called not only to refine how disputes are resolved across the continent, but to actively shape a future defined by legal excellence, economic vitality, and institutional maturity our nations so richly deserve. I'm particularly delighted and also to note in the morning we had Dr. Bayome of the African Arbitration Academy, an institution with which I've enjoyed long-standing enriching partnership. The Academy's role in advancing thought leadership, building human capital, and fostering cross-border legal collaboration is both invaluable and commendable. Their presence here symbolizes more than expertise. It is a bold reminder that a continental solidarity and knowledge sharing are the bedrock of transformative legal reform. Let us reflect briefly on the tangible impacts of litigation delays. I think this has been highlighted, echoed by the Honorable Chief Justice and the Attorney General, the Minister of Justice of the Republic of Rwanda. When a bridge contract is entangled in court proceedings, the bridge remains unbuilt. When a hospital procurement dispute is stalled, medical care is delayed. When public infrastructure is caught in legal red tape, citizens bear the burden. Justice delayed is not justice denied, it is also development denied. As governments are among the most active participants in commercial contracts, we must reach and adopting forward-thinking dispute resolution mechanisms. Arbitration nowadays is no longer a luxury, it is a necessity. A sobering reality confronts us. Africa loses more than $5 billion annually to foreign jurisdictions in arbitration expenditures. This is not mere an economic concern, it is a wake-up call. These are resources that could and should be retained to build our own legal and institutional capacities. Malawi, where I come from, has taken a bold and deliberate step in this direction. We, in 2021, ratified the New York Convention, becoming the 166th signatory. This global treaty remains the cornerstone of international arbitration. We followed later with a great milestone by enacting the International Arbitration Act in November 2023, and also which domesticated the universal model law and international benchmark legislative landscape. Together, these instruments position Malawi as a serious and credible participant in the international arbitration landscape. They also underpin the establishment of the Malawi International Arbitration Center and others, MIAC, our strategic response to the need for homegrown capacity and our declaration to the world that we are ready to host, manage, and lead arbitration proceedings on African soil by African experts and in line with international best practices. And also let me say this briefly, where I've said on a number of forums, the importance of harmonization. I think it has been said by the speakers, the panelists, that perhaps, of course, one panelist said that maybe litigation will be the key, but in this global landscape, arbitration is indispensable. Yet, even as individual nations make progress, we must confront a broader challenge, the lack of harmonization in legal systems across the continent. For Africa to realize the aspirations of Agenda 2063 and align with the UN Agenda 2030, we must speak a common legal language, one that promotes investment, protects commercial interests, and enhances judicial cooperation. Harmonizing our arbitration laws and commercial statutes will provide one, legal certainty for investors and legal practitioners alike. It will promote efficiency in transnational enforcement and also confidence in Africa as a dispute resolution destination. So arbitration is not just a legal tool, it is a developmental strategy endorsed by political leaders, embraced by private sector, and essential to unlocking Africa's investment potential. One of the arbitration's greatest strengths lies in party autonomy, allowing disputants to appoint arbitrators with industry-specific expertise. This raises the caliber, technicality, and legitimacy of arbitral laws. The training, I believe, has provided participants with important expertise. It is an invitation to reflect, to question, to connect, and above all, to prepare. Prepare to lead, prepare to shape the future of arbitration, prepare to build systems that are efficient, ethical, and equitable. I would like to offer a few substantive suggestions on key areas that warrant reform with a view to strengthening the overall framework and enhancing institutional efficiency, legal clarity, and long-term impact. The first one is establishing a modern arbitration legal framework. At the foundation of a credible arbitration regime lies a clear, coherent, and modern legal framework, one that recognizes and upholds the autonomy of parties to choose arbitration as their preferred method of dispute resolution. To date, we know that 36 African states have ratified the New York Convention. Notably, approximately 1/3 of these states have enacted national legislation based on the 1985 universal model law international commercial arbitration. This alignment reflects a growing commitment across the continent to harmonize with international best practices and foster investor confidence through predictable, transparent, and legal systems. Repealing obsolete legislation and promoting regional harmonization, as I said earlier on, remains a pressing need. There remains a pressing need to repeal and substantially reform outmoded arbitration laws that hinder the growth of effective dispute resolution mechanisms. At a minimum, African states, particularly those within the SADC region or sub-Saharan region, should adopt the UNISLAW model law in most recent and refined iteration. Such harmonization not only streamline arbitration regimes across borders, but also elevate credibility of arbitration throughout the region. Given that Africa as an economic and legal bloc, the weaknesses of one member state's legal framework inevitably cast hurdles on the reputation of others. Model laws are not simply aspiration, they embody tested international best practices. While the temptation to tailor arbitration laws to suit local context is understandable, such bespoke modifications may inevitably undermine legal certainty and introduce inconsistencies that deter users. Uniformity, by contrast, enhances certainty, predictability, credibility, and quality is highly valued by investors and parties across border disputes. Over time, jurisdictions such as Zambia, Malawi, Kenya, Rwanda may consider minor amendments to close implementation gaps, but the strength of model law lies in its global acceptance and adaptability. Each uniform adaptation lays the groundwork for organic and context-sensitive growth. Secondly, enacting progressive arbitration legislation is only the first step. The true measure of success lies in the quality of implementation. A vibrant arbitration ecosystem cannot thrive on legislative text alone. It requires active enforcement and understanding by all stakeholders, particularly the judiciary and commercial legal community. For this reason, continuous training and capacity building for judges, lawyers, and arbitrators are essential. The development of specialized commercial courts, the promotion of judicial restraint reviewing arbitral awards, and the legal framework are not only symbolic but functional. We heard from the Honorable Chief Justice in terms of independent and competent judiciary. At the heart of effective arbitration regime is an independent, competent, and efficient judiciary, one that respects party autonomy, upholds the sanctity of arbitral agreements, and interprets arbitration law with clarity and consistency. Judicial officers must be well versed in intricacies of international commercial arbitration, including the enforcement of awards and limited grounds for annulment or refusal of recognition. Their role is not to compete with arbitration, but to provide a supportive legal infrastructure that enables it to flourish. An arbitration-friendly judiciary signals to the international community that jurisdiction is serious about legal reform, economic development, and investor protection. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in an increasingly interconnected world where commerce moves faster than ever before. Disputes, while inevitable, must not become bottlenecks that paralyze development. Arbitration has emerged as the preferred mechanism for efficient, confidential, and expert-based resolution of such disputes. It offers parties the ability to resolve complex commercial matters swiftly and with a degree of procedural flexibility that traditional litigation cannot always afford. Importantly, arbitration does not stand in contradiction to the judiciary. Rather, it operates in complementarity. Courts must maintain oversight to ensure procedural and substantive integrity of arbitral proceedings. Arbitration, therefore, is not a competitor of the judiciary. It is a partner in advancing justice, especially in commercial contexts where time and certainty are paramount. As I conclude, I leave you with a challenge and an opportunity. That what you have done, you have engaged. Of course, you continue tomorrow in terms of the side events. Ask the difficult questions which have happened, and you have shared insights. You have collaborated with conviction. Let this conference become a springboard from which Africa's arbitration future is launched. Let us live here with renewed purpose, stronger networks, and deeper understanding that we are not only participants in arbitration's evolution, we are architects of its future in Africa. May God bless you all. May God bless Rwanda. May God bless our great continent, Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Honorable Attorney General of the Republic of Malawi, for the remarks. Secretary General of KIAC, please, may you come and guide your guests and the compensation, I hope, for taking much of their time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Macklin. Mine is just to thank you all, as I did this morning. And just to let you know, we are just going to have a very brief reception cocktail and like to showcase briefly the Rwandan culture. So we shall have a very brief dancing session. And because I know that people are very tired, you know, the program was very tight today. So we need to release people to get refreshed. So please join us at Le Foyer. It's just nearby to the exit. We shall be led now by Senior Counsel Florida. She's an arbitration practitioner here. She'll be leading us just to take over from Macklin. So the ladies here are leading, you know, in major events like this one. So Florida, thank you very much for joining us and taking us through the next session. So as we conclude, we just want to make some announcements. As I said, thank you very much. There are also some other events coming in just to supplement to this one. There is the African Arbitration Association Conference in Egypt. We shall be with the Prof in Egypt in October. Very soon in Nigeria with the East African Arbitration Conference. Those are events where we discuss further discussion to supplement this one. So thank you very much. Let me stop here. But please, please, please receive our exceptional thanks to all of you. We shall continue tomorrow with some side events here at the center and another one at KIAC. And thank you very much. Let's join the team, because the protocol team here is leading us to show where we're going to meet and take some refreshment and exchange. So nice evening, and thank you very much.